This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. 7:04 is the time on LBC. It's Iain Dale here with you until 10. Now, you know I like talking about prisons because I think it is a scandal the way that our prison system has been treated, not just over the last few years, but for the last few decades. If you're going to have 90,000 people in prison, then you need to have a prison estate that is able to cope with them. And it's only really latterly that the last government instituted a prison building programme, and there are going to be 14,000 more prison places over the next few years. However, that's not enough. Apparently, the new government say that even with that, they're still going to be 3,000 places short. I don't understand how that can happen, really, because the government is in control of the justice system. Well, sort of. The government is in control of sentencing guidelines. And if you know that you're going to have a shortfall, well, then you have to adapt your sentencing guidelines accordingly. To me, that is as clear as night follows day. I don't really understand what the alternative to that is. And if you want to build a new prison, well, build a new prison then, or build 3 new prisons if you want. I don't know how big new prisons are, but I'm sure there's probably upwards of 1,000 people in each prison. And as I said in the trail to the programme, if the French can rebuild Notre Dame Cathedral in 5 years, surely we can build a new prison in 3. I mean, is it really that complicated? Now, the Justice Secretary also says that she's going to have to overrule local planners because that's partly where the problem can lie. So what would you say to that, particularly if you are somebody who lives near a prison? I want to know whether it has any real effect on your life. Do you even notice it's there most of the time, apart from if you drive past it and you notice a wall with barbed wire on the top of it? What effect does it have on your life? So people who fear a new prison being built with them, are they just being NIMBYs? Maybe there is a new prison being built near you. What do you think about it? 0345 6060 973. Well, Aggie Chambray is here, LBC's political correspondent. Various politicians have been talking about this today, Aggie.
They have indeed. So the government today is announcing their 10-year prison capacity strategy. And this is effectively how they believe they can create 14,000 new prison places by 2031. You mentioned just there's already admittance from various politicians, that actually won't be enough. But they're going to build 4 new prisons, they say, 2 of which already have planning permission over the next 7 years. And then the other, that's about half the places, the other half is basically going to come from new wings, new blocks in existing prisons, they say. And this morning, the Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, told LBC's Nick Ferrari about what the government is doing about this crisis in prison space.
We already have 4 new prisons in the works. The strategy is very clear. We will deliver these 14,000. It includes these new prisons. And we've also said that if we need to buy more land and go beyond this, or for future prison projects, that we will streamline the planning process as well to make sure that prisons can be delivered faster in this country.
She's effectively saying, look, we could overrule councils. We will find a way to build these prisons, but also suggested that they're going to need to expand the range of punishment outside of prison too. But you can imagine the Conservatives aren't happy, and her opposite number, Robert Jenrick, told LBC the government isn't actually doing anything new, that's what he said, and is only piggybacking on the work of Rishi Sunak's administration.
Labour aren't proposing to build a single new prison beyond those that were already in train. The last government proposed to build 6 more. 6 more are being built. So there's not going to be any more jails. And the Justice Secretary has admitted that as a result of that and broader failing in the system, there's going to be a massive shortfall in prison places in the years ahead. And that means dangerous people who should be off our streets in prison as a matter of punishment and public protection will not be there. And the answers to it are, yes, build more prisons, but also get our courts sitting more, as the judiciary themselves have asked for, so that really important cases like rape and sexual assault are not being pushed back years. And, Nick, get the 10,500 foreign national offenders who are currently in our prisons out of our country.
Look, when Labour got into government back in July, there was already a kind of crippling prisons crisis. They had to let out thousands of inmates early and essentially said that if they hadn't done that, there would have been a proper crisis by August bank holiday. But as I say, they are suggesting they're going to build these new prisons. That's the prison capacity strategy. But there is also this plan to essentially send fewer people to prison in the first place. So Prisons Minister Lord Timpson spoke to LBC this afternoon and admitted it's going to take several years before the prison population goes down again.
The number of people in prison, the net increase is over 4,000 people a year. And it's going to take a long time for that curve to change, no matter how well we do on reducing reoffending and improving the outcomes of people leaving prison. So we're really clear we need to do other things as well, and that's why we've got the independent sentencing review that David Gauke is leading. And one of the things that I'm really excited about in my job is that this is an opportunity for long-term change. And I think that the days of short-term fixes in the justice, certainly in the prison and probation system, it hasn't clearly been working. So we really need to focus on the long-term changes.
So that review there that he mentioned that David Gauke is doing, that's going to come back in the spring. There are some suggestions that maybe that will come back with suggestions about doing a presumption against short sentences or even scrapping short sentences, which is something David Gauke, when he was Justice Secretary under the Conservatives, was in favour of. So it feels like this has got a long, long way to go, but it felt like there was some movement here with the government today announcing these building plans.
Aggie, thank you very much indeed. That's Aggie Chambray, LBC's political correspondent. Well, one of the things that I don't quite understand is the Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood there, she was saying there's 4 new prisons underway, there's 2 sort of going through the system. Robert Jenrick there confirming that there were 6 new prisons planned under the previous government. Well, if you know that the prison population is going to go up, or all the predictions are that it is, then surely you've got a duty to build more new prisons. And in addition, there are some really old-style prisons that surely should be replaced by new ones at the moment. I mean, look, I don't pretend to be an expert on prisons, but I think if you abolish short prison sentences and find other ways of punishing people, that inevitably, in the medium to long term, is going to reduce the prison population. It's been, 85 to 90,000 for the last few years. I don't see why it has to be that level, and yet we're told it's now going to be between 90 and 100,000. Something is going wrong somewhere. Well, Andrea Coomber, KC, is Chief Executive of the Howard League for Penal Reform and joins me now. Andrea, very good evening to you. Now, I could vaguely see you in the corner of my eye nodding at some of the things I just said there. What is going wrong here? Because successive governments never seem to be able to get to grips with either building new prisons or indeed the sentencing guidelines.
No, I mean, I think successive governments now for the last 25 years have engaged in criminal justice legislation, which has seen sentences get longer and longer for an ever-growing list of offences without proper consideration of the ability of the criminal justice system, whether that's the courts but also the prisons, to deal with the consequences of those changes to law. It's very easy to say, we're going to have increases in sentences for X and Y, but that means people go to prison, and whereas 20 years ago they might have come out after 5 years, they now stay in prison for 15 years or 20 years. And so you have more and more people in prison for longer. And unfortunately, the getting rid of the short sentences doesn't solve the prison problem. Getting rid of short sentences altogether would bring down the prison population by about 2,000-3,000 people. So it's a lot of people in the course of a year churning through, and absolutely we don't think those people should be in prison because they have really high rates of reoffending. They really need to have the causes of their offending dealt with in the community. But you need to have a serious look at people who are there for longer, and that's what the sentencing review will hopefully be looking at.
How long does it take to build a new standard size prison, whatever a standard size is?
Well, the last government delivered 2, Five Wells and Fossway, and then the four that were announced today have actually, Rob Jenrick's right, they were in the plans, but they struggled with planning permission for years in each case. I mean, it takes years to build prisons. And my understanding is that these prisons will still take years. One of them will be open next May. The other 3 will take a number of years to come online. I mean, the strategy that was released today talks about sort of 1 a year from 2026, 2027, 2028. I have to say, I don't think that they'll be able to pull that off. So in the end, they're going to be left with building kind of these small house blocks and putting effectively demountable units into existing prisons. And I think worth remembering that the prisons we currently have are struggling with numbers of people and overcrowding and lack of staff and lack of capable staff and experienced staff. And they're not delivering meaningful regime to give people the tools to stop reoffending when they come out. So we're in a situation where we're already struggling with the number of people we've got in prison, and now we're just going to pile more people into more buildings.
So if you were Prisons Minister, what would you be doing different to what the current Prisons Minister is doing?
I would be stopping the building of the new prisons, frankly, because they're a massive investment of public money, £10 billion, to not deal with the problem. I mean, as Shabana made very clear today, the Secretary of State, she's going to build these prisons, but they're not going to touch the sides of the extent of the problem, and invest that money instead in the things we know cut crime, like services in the community for mental health, drug support, in probation services. I mean, probation, much as the prisons are full, probation is overfull as well. I mean, probation system is on its knees with huge caseloads, lack of resource, lack of support for probation officers. I mean, I think it's worth remembering that 4 out of 5 people who are in a court are reoffending. Our prisons just have people churning through them because they're not places of rehabilitation. We're very good at punishing them.
No, that is very true. But can I push back on that a minute? I mean, I was quite astonished to hear you say that you would abolish all of the prison building programme, because surely you can't be in favour of some of the conditions that there are at our older prisons, and there are plenty of them. I mean, some of them dating back to Victoria times. So the only way to deal with that, you're never going to be able to modernise the likes of Shepton Mallet prison. I assume that's still open. It's one that I visited someone in once. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And it really is from the Victorian age. I mean, surely you'd want to see new prisons built to replace those.
I mean, that's not what's being suggested. So, I mean, I would take, if I get the 10 billion to spend, I'm spending a fair bit of that in the existing prison estate. But prisons, I live near Pentonville Prison, for example, that is a Victorian jail, and it needs a lot of support. Its kitchen was closed over the summer for 3 months because of a rat infestation. I mean, it is a crumbling Victorian building, but Victorian jails happen to be in city centres and are well located for courts. So our court system, which is also kind of in trouble, doesn't work if prisons like Pentonville or Wormwood Scrubs or Brixton get closed down. We need them to service the courts, because a huge number of people in prison, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 5 men, are actually on remand awaiting conviction, awaiting trial or awaiting sentence. And that's something that the government really needs to grapple with. So if I'm Prisons Minister, I'm dealing with the remand population, because you can get out a huge amount of people. A lot of those people, don't need to be remanded to custody, frankly, because they end up being acquitted or found sentenced to less time than they've served. And that starts freeing up space. The problem we have is that there are just far too many people in prison who are there because of poor mental health, because they've got troubles with family relationships, because they've got troubles with drugs, and we don't treat the causes. We don't address the causes of people's offending in this country.
How much could we reduce the prison population by if the kind of people you're talking about weren't in prison, and if the kind of people that I'm talking about, which are people that aren't a danger to the public, if they weren't in prison either, and we found other ways? And I'm sure as the Howard League have been reformed, half of them. So
at least.
And that would take us back to about 1992, before Michael Howard became Home Secretary, when I think the prison population 44,000, I think it was in those days. Yep. So half what we have now.
At least.
But then, of course, you look at it from the politician's point of view. And if Shabana Mahmood came around the TV and radio studios tomorrow and said, "I'm going to let half of the people out of prison," Well, we can imagine what the opinion polls would say. I mean, Labour would go down to about 15% probably. So that's not going to happen, is it? It's politically unrealistic.
No, it's politically unrealistic, but because I think the politicians don't tell the public the truth about what prison can and cannot achieve. You know, the prison is kind of given as this way of solving crime. And, you know, if you put people in prison, then the public is protected. And the truth is the public is only protected for as long as people are in prison. But all but 65 people who are in our prisons will be returning to the community. They're all coming out. So we need them to come out in a way that they become good neighbours and good friends. And the best way to do that is to make sure that prison is reserved for those people who really need to be there for as long as they actually need to be there. So if you go to somewhere like the Netherlands, you know, they've got a third as many people in prison per head of population as we have, because they reserve prison for people who need to be taken out of circulation for a period of time to be able to have their problems dealt with, to do courses, to do mental health and socialisation interventions, and then they're released with support, whereas we take people with complicated lives who've made bad mistakes with terrible consequences sometimes, and we lock them up for 38 years and wonder, you know, why we have full prisons.
I was going to make an ill-advised joke about the Dutch being spaced out on cannabis so they don't commit so many crimes.
You know what? They don't get sent to prison for it anymore, Ian.
No, I know they don't, but I realise that in this day and age you can't make a joke at all. I'd be accused of being Dutch-phobic or something, but I probably still will be. Thank you very much, Andrea. Good to talk to you. That's Andrea Kumar-Casey, Chief Executive of the Howard League for Penal Reform. Lots of calls coming in. We'll come to them in just a moment. 0345 6060 973. Particularly keen to hear from you. If you live near a prison, what impact does it have on you and your community?
This is LBC with Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973.
22 minutes past 7 on LBC. John says, hold on a minute, Ian. You just said I don't pretend to be an expert on prisons, but you have said on many occasions that if you'd been elected an MP, you would have liked to have been prisons minister. Perfect self-proclaimed qualifications. I hear what you say, Jake, but you don't have to have committed a murder to be Home Secretary. You don't have to be a teacher to be Education Secretary. I like to think I know a bit more about prisons than I do about some other subjects. I'd actually like to be in Transport Minister. But you don't have to have had exam qualifications to be a minister, as we evidently see. Tony's in Maidstone. Hello, Tony.
Oh, hi, Ian. Hi. So I thought I'd give a quick call about this. Now, who was the person you spoke to before? Was it he or she? What's her name?
Andrea, who's from the Howard League for Penal Reform.
Andrea. Now, I'm surprised. I was quite surprised when she said 50% have mental health issues, because I wanted to talk about that. I was going to say at least, so the prison population is about 90,000, 100,000. Yeah. Because my brother's only just come out of prison. He was in there. He's a paranoid schizophrenic, which I would not wish that illness on my worst enemy. He's better now. But he was in prison because there was no beds for him to go into like a hospital for his needs. And I think there's so many people who are getting sent to prison for crimes that, should we say, are not as serious as, GBH or ABH or murder or stuff like that. But there's so many in there for, like, drug offences. Well, drug dealers, I think, are the worst of the worst. So I think they should be in there. But people who have got mental health issues, but there's no beds. And, my brother, he had to wait in A&E for 3 days because there was no beds. But then he was put in a prison before he was transferred to a mental health hospital. So I think, I don't think we should be sending as many people to prisons. Especially
it is quite clear that there ought to be places for people who purely have mental health issues, whether it's paranoid schizophrenia or whatever. And at the moment, well, we know that there aren't the places available. So that's why they end up in prison. But of course, that exacerbates the problem, because you're never going to, if you have that kind of issue and you're in prison, I doubt very much whether there's a short road to any sort of medical treatment or recovery. Tony, thank you. Let's go to Angus in Islington. Angus, hello.
Hello, Ian. Very important debate you're having, so thank you. I just think we need to move the debate away from incarceration, which is what we tend to do, to rehabilitation. For instance, and learn from other countries, and not just theoretically, but other countries have solved it. In Holland, they closed 19 prisons, not built prisons. They closed 19 in 2013, and we should look to see how they did it. And the result of closing is not more criminals. Their reoffending rate, which is presumably the whole metric by which you judge any prison system, is 10% reoffend within 2 years in Holland, whereas in the UK and the US, it's 50%. So they're 5 times as effective as our prison system is. And they closed 19. So what on earth we're thinking of building more prisons, I do not know. And what do you think the most important metric is? Is it catching criminals or locking them up forever? And we are opting for the second. And it's the most expensive form of accommodation imaginable.
I don't believe that those figures were achieved purely by closing prisons. There has to be an element of the sentencing regime that plays a role here. The court system may be very different. I don't know. But what I do agree...
There's a very interesting BBC assignment they did it on it, and in The Independent reported it in 2017. And what they did, they used a lot of ankle monitoring. They created open prisons. They used a lot of high-tech technology to check where people were, and they shifted the money which they were spending on prisons and keeping them locked up to training people. So when they come out of prison, they've got a skill, they can get accommodation. It's a total reorientation of how we treat people and how we rehabilitate people. And the proof of the pudding is it works in the data. And I suggest the government, both governments, need to look at it very carefully. Their problem in Holland was they didn't know what to do with the prisons, so they started importing Norwegian prisoners to give their prison staff a job.
Well, I look forward to the day when we're in that position. Angus, thank you very much indeed.
We need to look. We need to look at others and stop
we
going down
do.
the same, we don't.
But I mean, all of
we're not thinking properly.
All of the things that you've said, we're actually doing. I mean, the tagging, the technology, the open prisons, we're doing all of that. Maybe not to the extent that we need to, but these are not new ideas, are they?
No, they're not. And we just need to follow it. The trouble is the politicians haven't the courage to say, this system doesn't work, neither Labour nor Conservative. We need to stop building prisons, have the political courage to come on and say, we've got to get reoffending rates down, and we've got to follow people who know who've done it.
OK, Angus, thank you. Nick is in Colnbrook in Berkshire. Hello, Nick.
Good evening. I wish I had more strings to my bow, but let me start this way. At the moment, we have a government that imprisons many people for many reasons, but sometimes they're not the reasons that the people actually want people to go to prison for. Let's start with a minor correction, Nick, or an important correction. It's not the government that sends people to prison; it's the court system.
OK, well, somebody's got to make the laws to start with. What I'm trying to say is, for instance, and there's only two strings that I can think of at the moment. One is, do we actually want the BBC to have a licence? We actually get sent to prison for not buying one, but we're the only country, I believe, that does have a BBC licence to have a TV set. No other country does that. Same thing with legalising cannabis or legalising drugs even. This would also drop down the number of people that get sent to prison. I don't smoke in any way whatsoever, so I've got no string in that bow. But the point being that people have the right to do what they wish to do, and if enough people say, yes, we like this, then it shouldn't be illegal. It should be legal because the number of people wish it to be.
Yeah, but there are always little pet hobby horses that people have. I don't know how many people there are in prison for not paying their TV licences. I suspect it's comparatively few. Drug offences, it'll be more. I could also say that if you want to declog the court system in many parts of London, what you should do is say that speeding offences won't be dealt with anymore in the courts. They will be dealt with outside the court system because, and I've got personal experience of this, because I've pled not guilty to a speeding offence going out on the A20, like I think 60,000 other people have when the speed limit was not clearly signed. There's a huge campaign here, and there are literally thousands of people that are being taken to court through no fault of their own. Now, all it would need was for Sadiq Khan or the head of the Metropolitan Police to strike them off, and the court system would be free to deal with proper criminals. And yes, people will say, well, you shouldn't have been speeding. Well, I wouldn't have been had I known that the speed limit had been changed without them telling anybody. And I'm not the only one there. So there are all sorts of ways that you can speed things up through the court system. As you say, there are all sorts of ways you can reduce the prison population if you change some of the guidelines, if you change some of the laws regarding what constitutes an imprisonable offence. Thank you very much, Nick. OK, 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. Somebody pointing out that Austria has a mandatory TV licence system as well. It's 7:31 on LBC. Let me just tell you who's on Cross Question before we go to the news. Mike Tapp, the Labour MP for Dover and Deal. Joe Gideon, commentator and former Conservative MP, Reem Ibrahim from the Institute for Economic Affairs, and Will Hutton, the political economist, who's a columnist for The Observer and also its former editor.
Iain Dale on LBC.
7:34 on LBC. Now, the father and stepmother of 10-year-old Sarah Sharif have been found guilty of her murder. Sarah was hooded, burned and beaten during more than 2 years of abuse before her body was found with dozens of injuries at the family's home in Woking in Surrey last year. Her father, Irfan Sharif, stepmother, Bainash Batul, and uncle, Faisal Malik, travelled to Islamabad, Pakistan, with Sarah's siblings on the 9th of August 2023, the day after she died. Well, Malik was found guilty of causing or allowing her death. Let's get more on this from Emma Core, LBC's correspondent, who's been following this case at the Old Bailey.
Well, Ian, it's been an incredibly distressing trial for everyone in that courtroom, particularly the jury, who, after 9 weeks of listening to evidence, came to a conclusion today that Sarah's father, Irfan Sharif, was guilty of the murder of his 10-year-old daughter. Sarah's stepmother, Bainash Batul, was left sobbing in the dock as jurors confirmed she had been found guilty of murder, while Sarah's uncle, Faisal Malik, who was living with the family at the time of Sarah's death, found guilty of causing or allowing the death of a child. Sarah's body was found on a bunk bed as if she was in bed asleep on the 10th of August last year, after her father, Irfan Sharif, made this phone call to Surrey Police.
He was naughty after the teacher started. I'm going to need you to slow down, okay? How have you killed your daughter? I beat her up. It wasn't my intention to kill her, but I beat her up too much.
Well, Irfan Sharif, Bainash Batul and Faisal Malik, they'd all left for Pakistan the day before that phone call was made, booking flights to the country just hours after Sarah died. Now, beside Sarah's body, Surrey Police found a note written by Irfan Sharif echoing what he said in that phone call. But Surrey Police were shocked to discover how Sarah had been suffering, and I want to warn here, some of these details, Ian, are very distressing, but important to share what this 10-year-old girl endured. There was evidence of extensive bruising to Sarah, burns, some inflicted with a domestic iron, evidence of scalding with boiling water. She had over 25 fractures and human bite marks were found on her body. Also evidence she'd been beaten with objects, including a cricket bat, and signs her head had been covered with homemade hoods made of plastic bags and parcel tape. The prosecution in this trial describing the treatment of the 10-year-old in the last 3 weeks of her life as brutal, with those multiple and extensive injuries sustained over an extended period of time. They think she was suffering abuse for over 2 years. Detective Superintendent Mark Chapman led the investigation.
We heard little bits about what Sarah was like in this case from her teachers, from some of the people that knew her, described her as being a bright and lively little girl who liked singing and dancing. And through this prosecution, it's been our real focus to make sure that we absolutely deliver justice for her.
Well, Irfan Sharif initially denied beating Sarah during this trial, but halfway through his witness testimony told the court he took full responsibility for her death, but continued to deny murder. Binash Batul and Faisal Malik didn't take the stand, but we did hear in evidence over the past 9 weeks from neighbours of the Sharif family and teachers from Sarah's school about what she was like, and Surrey Police described some there. Her mother, Olga Sharif, actually put out a statement today saying everyone who knew Sarah will know her unique character, her beautiful smile and loud laugh. She will always be in our hearts. Her laughter will bring warmth to our lives, and we miss Sarah very much. The jury deciding today that Sarah's father, Irfan Sharif, is guilty of Sarah's murder. Her stepmother, Binash Batul, also guilty of murder, and her uncle, Faisal Malik, guilty of causing or allowing the death of a child, and they'll all be sentenced next week on Tuesday the 17th of December at the Old Bailey.
Emma, thank you very much indeed. That's Emma Core, LBC's correspondent, who's been following this case at the Old Bailey. I've never believed in the death penalty, but there are people I would make an exception for, and Irfan Sharif would be one of those. I hope he gets the maximum possible life sentence when the sentence is handed down next week. 7:39. Well, let's return to our subject of prisons. We're talking about two things, really. How can we reduce the prison population? Should we be building more prisons? And if we are going to build them, why aren't they being built more quickly? And if you live near a prison, I'd love to know how it affects you and your life. 0345 6060 973. Dave's in Worcester. Hello, Dave.
Hello, good evening, Ian. That was something to hear earlier on, something to hear. That was dreadful, terrible.
You just cannot comprehend how a human being can mete out that kind of treatment.
Give me a second.
Well, Dave, it is upsetting, and I think anybody listening to the details of what that man did.
Like I've said before, the reality is we can't. As I've said many a times on the radio, the reality is let's not reduce ourselves to barbarity, and let's be decent, educated, honest people. And what you were saying earlier on about people going to prison doesn't work. The reality is most prisons, people go to prison because they are poor, sad people, and it's an economic question. And if we lived in a society that was more equal and more just, there'd be very, very little crime. Very little crime indeed.
I'm sorry, but
I know you disagree.
Sorry. I do disagree with you, because this man, his economic circumstances didn't drive him to beat up a 10-year-old girl. His evil personality did that. It's quite clear. You can't. There's no one to blame but him.
But Ian, that's an exception, and this is the reality cannot, and the facts cannot go with an exception. And we don't know. I don't know that it's a dreadful situation, but the reality is we have got the highest prison population in Western Europe. It doesn't work, and it's caused by inequality. And I know you don't want to hear that, Ian, because you believe in capitalism. I don't. I think capitalism is an evil system run by a tiny minority of people so they can get rich, and it creates all the problems that we live under. And it's not even capitalism anymore, Ian. It's a kind of dictatorship of a tiny minority of people.
Give me a break. Well, what would you replace it with then?
Well, I'd like to live in a democracy where
we do live in a democracy.
Well, that's the veil, Ian. That's the veil.
Do you get to vote in local elections? Do you get to vote in national elections? Yes, you do. We have a democracy. Simple as that.
Well, no, that's not as simple as that. Democracy as I think it was George Washington said, I think it was Thomas Jefferson said, democracy is where people take part, and it's not about a tiny minority of elitists that say we live in a democracy, and we don't, because it's not working, Ian.
Everybody's entitled to take part.
It's not working. Yeah, but
it may not be working, but everybody can take part.
Ian, who owns the newspapers? Who owns the media? How often do you hear voices like mine on the media or on?
Well, I'm hearing it now.
Oh, come on. Well, yes, very, 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 very rare. The voice of reason and the voice of truth is excluded.
It's not rare. It's not rare on LBC. Rare, it's 24 hours a day.
You. Well, I agree. LBC is probably one of the only news stations, not the state broadcaster, which we're forced to pay for. They won't put me on, but at least you do. You're quite rare. But it's quite rare, Ian, and you know it's rare.
No, I don't know it's rare at all.
Well, I think you do know.
People nowadays have more. If you keep talking over me, we're not going to get very far. The point is that nowadays everyone has more of a say than they ever did 20, 30, 40 years ago, when your only say, Dave, would be in the Worcester Bugle. Maybe once a year you might get a letter published, whereas now you can go on your local radio, you can go on your national radio, you can have your say on all sorts of websites, which you wouldn't have been able to do 20 years ago. So don't tell me that people haven't got an opportunity to have their say now, because it's you have more of a say now than you ever did before.
I disagree with you. The reality...
Well, you can say you disagree with me, but you can provide no evidence for disagreeing with me.
Allow me to. The reality is, I think the reality wasn't the Worcester Bugle, it was the Worcester News. But the reality is, Ian, the reality is, I think you're quite scared of social media because it's showing the truth of what's going on around the world.
Come on. I don't know if you know my history on social media, but I was one of the first political bloggers in this country. I'm well used to social media, and I welcome social media. I don't welcome the downsides of social media, but the fact is social media has democratised things in a way that nothing else has done for decades.
Well, that's good, isn't it?
I'm not saying it isn't.
The mainstream media is owned by the rich, and the rich are bad. They're bad people, Ian. They're bad people.
Seriously, a poor person... No, they're not. A poor person is not going to own a TV station, are they?
Yeah, but the rich, because they're bad and they're so obsessed by money and greed and wealth. They're bad people.
Please. How many rich people do you know?
Too many. They're bad.
Well, I know quite a lot of rich. I know 3 billionaires. I know other people who are very rich. And I can think of one or two who would fit your category, but most of them are actually very good people. Look, I work for a company that is owned by a very rich person, and I think he's a fundamentally good person. And I'm not just saying that because he pays my fees, because I've seen evidence of it in all sorts of different ways. And you can't just say that because somebody's rich, they're automatically a bad person.
Usually under the system we live under, which is the accumulation of wealth off the backs of other people. And we've been sold a lie, you see. This is what we've been sold. These entrepreneurs, they're not entrepreneurs, they're exploiters. They exploit people.
No, they're not.
They don't get money. Well, they are.
Well, there'll be the odd one that is. Absolutely, there'll be the odd one that is. Just as in all walks of society, there are bad people. There are bad people in the health service. There are bad people in education. There are bad people in business. There are bad people in politics. We're human beings. Some of us are bad.
But Ian, where do they get their money from? They get their money by exploiting people.
No, they generally get their money because they've taken a risk with their own money, and they've been successful in business, and therefore they've accumulated wealth, and then they reinvest it. That's the way capitalism works.
Well, it's a lie. We've been told a lie. I wish it was true, Ian. They don't risk anything. Most people have inherited wealth.
Well, you clearly know nothing about the way entrepreneurialism... Well, as I say, if you keep talking over me, we're not going to get very far. You clearly know nothing about entrepreneurialism. I've started 7 businesses in my time, so I think I know a little bit. I haven't made any money out of any of them, but there we go. Maybe I'm not evil enough.
Maybe you're not. Well, anyway, we'll have to disagree to agree. But
we will.
The reality is, Ian, I'll leave you on this, Ian, before we go. The truth, and you know I'm telling the truth, and it's the truth. and it's bad. And if society and humanity is to live, we've got to cooperate, not exploit each other. Take care, brother.
There endeth the lesson by Jeremy Corbyn. Dave, thank you very much indeed.
Iain Dale. Text 84850. This is LBC.
Now, Cross Question is coming up in around 10 minutes' time. Get your questions in now on 0345 6060 973. But first, I want to hear from the author of a new book which reflects on a really dark time in the history of football in this country. The 1980s weren't a dark time because of what was going on the pitch, but because of the violence being witnessed so often on the sidelines, alongside still infamous tragedies like the Valley Parade fire and the Hillsborough disaster in Heysel. The football historian John Sperling has written a new book about how the sport was dominated by violence and tragedy right before it was transformed into the multi-billion-pound business it has become today. The book is called Go to War, Football on the Brink in the 80s, and I asked John how widespread nostalgia for what the sport used to be like has become.
I think it's becoming more popular. I think there's a feeling amongst fans of my age, I'm 54, perhaps slightly younger and a lot older, that perhaps the football that we saw pre-1992, pre the Sky era, is slowly being airbrushed from history. And
there's a reason for that.
Yeah, that's right.
It wasn't as good.
It's got its issues. I mean, some of the football that you see during that era now hasn't always stood the test of time, and yet, as you allude to, it surprises me that there is that kind of nostalgia. And I think perhaps during the 70s and 80s, you could still describe football as the working man's game. I think ticket prices were still within the reach of many fans. One of the things that I see more and more as I struggle to get my own kids to football because of, ticketing and that kind of thing, is that you used to see groups of youngsters going with each other to the game. It was more of a camaraderie experience in that way. And that's more difficult today with all-seater stadia and the prices and that kind of thing. But, of course, as I've shown, football in the 70s and 80s, the stadia were poor. The infrastructure was rotting, as we saw in the 80s particularly. And it is a game in dire trouble. I mean, the Sunday Times described it as a slum sport in 1985. We saw the tragedies of Heysel, the Bradford fire in 85. But I mean, ultimately, what I'm hoping to show with this book is that actually the seeds of what football became were also being sown in the 80s as well.
Because it wasn't all bad in the 80s in terms of football. However, I think if you were walking down the street and saying, right, give me your three main memories of football in the 80s, they'll say Hillsborough, they'll say Heysel, and they'll say Bradford.
Yep.
The three tragedies.
Yeah.
Now, there was a huge amount of great football. I mean, if you ask me that question, I say the boys of 86, West Ham nearly winning the league.
Yeah, that's right.
You always want to look at these things
and McAvenny era.
through rose-tinted spectacles.
Yeah.
But it is a decade that, I mean, did have these awful tragedies, and which had long-term effects on the game.
It did. That's right. I mean, those tragedies still sit above that era, and it's what the era is noted for. But I mean, what I try and look at in the book, as well as dealing with those terrible events, is that I also look at the fact that the game as we know it now is slowly becoming clear. So you have various chairman at clubs like Irving Scholar at Tottenham, Martin Edwards at Manchester United, David Dean at Arsenal, who was vice chairman, but they are starting to look at the corporate side of the game. Which is becoming a big thing by the end of the 80s. You see the bigger clubs wanting a bigger slice of the pie. So where the clubs used to share the gate money with the visiting club, that goes. They make a power grab in 1985, which is kind of, as Martin Edwards said, the first signs that a Premier League is going to happen. They want more voting rights. They want increased slice of the very, very low TV money. And that is starting to happen. I don't think any of those directors realised, though, what football would become. I mean, Martin Edwards said to me that what we wanted is our clubs to do well. The landscape for football appeared so bleak at the time that they're just looking to survive. It's kind of more accident than design that it starts to take shape.
But it was the TV money that changed everything in 1992, wasn't it? And
yes,
that they had been working towards that for some years, I think. But it was only really the advent of the Premier League and the Sky deal that changed things completely.
Yeah.
And you say to people, I was talking to someone the other day who's 20, 21 years old, could not believe that there were only like 3 matches shown, recorded highlights on Match of the Day.
Yeah.
So there was no live football?
That's right.
Well, no, there wasn't.
Because, of course, in West Ham's season, when they finished third, there was a blackout, wasn't there, from until January. So Frank McAvenny kind of got a free pass for months, as Tony Cottee said it probably helped him. But yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And it's not until the late 80s that you see Greg Dyke from ITV breaking the BBC ITV cartel and bidding more to show live football. And that happened really because of the mere presence of B-Sky B, where they are now an entity by the late 80s. They pull out of the bidding in the end, but ITV bid more, and it shows that football is perhaps something that's worth investing in. And obviously what you have at the very end of the 80s in 89, May 89, is Arsenal winning the league at Anfield, where it's on a Friday night, so it's kind of like Sunday football, Monday nights, but all rolled into one and then some. And I think the drama of that night and the converging themes of tragedy, salvation, a young team emerging, all of that rolls together and shows that football is perhaps a product that is worth investing in, which then comes to fruition in the 90s.
How much do you cover the lower leagues in the book? Because though I've always been a West Ham supporter. In the 1980s, I didn't go to West Ham very much. And I'm trying to remember, was that a deliberate decision because I just didn't like all of the hooliganism, all that side of it? Or what? Because I lived in Walthamstow in the latter part of the 1980s, so it would have been very easy to go. But I did go and see Gillingham quite a lot.
Right.
And it was obviously a very, very different experience. It's almost a different kind of spectator experience watching lower league football, but I think a lot of people nowadays have made that journey because they're fed up with the corporatism of the Premier League, and they get much more out of going to see a lower league club.
That's right. I think they are. They're fed up with some of the overblown nature of football. The fact it's such a big thing now. So I look at the FA Cup in the 80s, as well as looking at some of the finals. I look at Sutton United beating Coventry in 88. That's right. I look at Chorley beating Wolves when Wolves literally looked like they were about to disappear as a club. Tommy Docherty, one of their managers, described them as the Miss Havisham of football, literally sitting there, waiting to die. Ironically, that night watching that game is Steve Bull in the stands, who's just been signed, who was the salvation. So I look at that, and also look at Telford United as well, who actually had beat more league clubs than any other team in non-league teams in the 80s, but perhaps they didn't get the publicity that a Chorley got or that a Sutton got, because they tended to beat third, fourth division teams rather than a scout from the top
flight. But the FA
flight.
Cup was still magical in the 1980s,
yes, it was.
Wasn't it? It's only really, I would say, in this century that it's really diminished in importance. But then, we're recording this the day after the third round draw in which Manchester City drew Salford, and you think, what an amazing tie that is.
Yes. And the Tottenham draw as well.
You put money on Salford at the moment, wouldn't you?
You might well do. You might well do. It was one of the few games that was shown live. You would get England-Scotland. You might get a European final if one of the English teams was in it. But apart from that, the cup final was the game. 20 million plus audiences. You'd also have the build-up from breakfast with Mastermind. Yeah, that's right. Various events. That's right. Exactly right.
Bit of giant haystacks.
Yeah, that's right. You'd have Freddie Starr in his politically incorrect activities as well. So it was a huge day. And in the book I speak to, say, Ricky Villa, who won the FA Cup for Tottenham in 81, Norman Whiteside for Manchester United in 85, and the Coventry team as well. So it was the FA Cup was still at its very best in the 80s, no doubt about that.
Well, it's a fascinating story. Presumably, you're currently writing the 90s book.
I am.
Yeah, what a surprise!
Oh, what a surprise! That's right. It's got to be done. It's the holy trinity, hopefully, of that side of the history. So that will be out in a couple of years' time. Definitely, yes.
And that's the football historian John Sperling, and his book is called Go to War: Football on the Brink in the 80s. And do buy it. It's really worth a read.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 8:02. Welcome to the programme. It's Wednesday's Cross Question. On the panel, we have Will Hutton, political economist, who's a columnist for The Observer and also its former editor. Of course, The Observer is up for sale at the moment. You might want to ask a question on that because, as I've just discovered in the news, Will's got some quite interesting views on it. Joe Gideon is sitting next to him, campaigner, social commentator and former Conservative MP. To my right, Reem Ibrahim, communications manager for the Institute of Economic Affairs, and next to her, Mike Tapp, the Labour MP for Dover and Deal. The number to call, 0345 6060 973. You can WhatsApp us on that number too and text 84850 and watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's go to our first caller. It's Lynn in Sidcup. Hello, Lynn.
Hello, Ian. How are you?
I'm terribly well, Lynn. What would you like to ask?
I would like to ask if we had prisons that were tougher, surely we would not have so many reoffenders. Now, prisons, as far as I'm aware, are really little holiday camps.
Oh,
so
please.
If they weren't, surely we would not have so many reoffenders.
Now, Lynn, you sound a very nice lady, but have you ever been in a prison, either as a prisoner or to visit somebody in prison?
I have visited someone in prison, yes. However,
Did the prison that you went to strike you as a holiday camp?
No, that's probably exaggeration. However, I feel that if they weren't, I can't explain myself, but I think if they weren't not even as good as they appear to be.
So you think they should be harsher? That's what you're getting at.
I do,
Okay.
absolutely. And maybe
Right,
wouldn't have so many reoffenders.
Let's put that to our panel. Will Hutton, let's start with you. I mean, there is a certain logic to that argument. If you make prisons the most horrible places possible, people are going to make sure they don't go to them. That's essentially what Lynn is arguing.
Lynn, I don't agree with you. I understand why you say what you say. I mean, we are all worried about street crime. Massive amounts of mobile phones get stolen kind of every day now. But, I mean, Britain's incarceration rate is significantly the highest in Europe. We put more people away than any other country in Europe. And it hasn't really kind of had a commensurate impact on our crime rate. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that, I'm with Winston Churchill. When he was Home Secretary in 1910, he said that you can judge a civilization by how it treats its prisoners and how it regards prison. Is it a place to kind of, throw people into a dungeon and throw away the key, or is it a place where you try to rehabilitate folk? And if you think about rehabilitation, I mean, our prisons are so overcrowded that it's close to impossible. The amount of hours a day that you can spend kind of learning a new skill or dealing with your psychological problems, whatever it is that you've got, are kind of minimal. And the last thing to say is that actually prisons today are incredibly overcrowded. I mean, they're 2 to a cell, 3 to a cell in cells that were only organised for one person. Often a kind of incredible kind of running with rats, water on the walls and damp. You get very ill in them. The idea that a holiday camp is kind of far, far from the truth. Rory Stewart, who was an ex-Tory MP, in his book actually describes his 18 months as prisons minister and actually gives a very graphic account of some of the prisons he visited, which were just ghastly. So, there is a job of work to be done here. We have to think about how we're going to kind of get the crime rate down. We've got to think about how we deter people. But it's not to start with the assumption that today's prisons are a holiday camp, I think is the wrong place to look.
Joe Gideon.
So I think that prisons are for people who we want to keep out of society, so for serious offences. I don't think they're the right place for, shall I say, minor offences, but we do need to have alternatives, so the public need to feel that people are sufficiently punished for whatever crime. I remember I did some work with a veteran charity, and I found that at that point, about a quarter of the prison population were ex-veterans. And I think there is something around reoffending and being institutionalised, that people who come out and don't have a viable alternative when they come out, and we know that people often come out with very little cash and very little opportunity to turn their lives around. The only place that they know that they will have 3 square meals a day is prison.
Yeah.
So we need to address these things.
But what about the prison conditions themselves? Should they be harsher than they are?
Well, I mean, I did go into a prison in the Isle of Sheppey as a visitor. It was not a pleasant experience, and that was one of the modern prisons. From what I read, prisons are not much fun, and I don't think that making the regimes tougher and even more overcrowded is going to help.
OK. Mike Tapp.
So I have the privilege of sitting on the Justice Select Committee, and a few weeks ago we actually visited the prison in Brixton, and that was not good conditions at all.
That's a really old prison.
It's a Victorian prison, and there's 2 to a cell. The one prisoner is defecating where in the same room that the other is eating. They're a mess. It's falling to pieces. The Isle of Sheppey is a good example of a prison that has low reoffending rates. But I think going back to the good question, it's about balance. It's about ensuring that you are punishing violent and dangerous offenders, keeping them in prison.
But isn't the punishment depriving them of their freedom? I mean, if you're subjecting a human being to inhumane circumstances, that's a double punishment.
And I was my next point was going to be, you don't need inhumane conditions. Of course, it shouldn't go as far as a holiday camp, but not inhumane. What the focus has to be on those that are in prison is rehabilitation, of course, to ensure that when they do come out, that they don't commit the crime again, and whether that's violent crime or fraud or whatever they're in for. And that is going to take a lot of investment and time to get up to scratch, to be quite frank. And one of the big concerns that I have in prisons, having worked for the National Crime Agency, is the drugs getting in through serious.
Did you work for? I didn't know that.
I certainly
What did you used to do?
So I worked in the intelligence side of things before I went on to a counter-terrorism.
So obviously you can't talk about that at all.
That would be irresponsible of me. But I can tell you that I did work on some prison crime and against some of the gangs that were running drugs in, and they've become very creative.
But that's an exciting job. Why have you gone from that to go into politics?
I can assure you, Ian, this is just as exciting as pursuing dangerous criminals.
OK, Reem Ibrahim.
Yes, I agree with most of what was said on the panel already. I do think that what Joe picked up on is really important, that actually there probably are too many crimes at the moment that end up resulting in a prison sentence. I don't think, for example, that case of the Conservative councillor's wife that tweeted something quite disgusting during the riots, I don't think someone like her should be receiving an 18-month prison sentence for a Twitter post, or an X post, sorry. So I think that fundamentally we probably put too many people in prison as a result of very, very non-violent and, in my view, very, very minor crimes, things that probably shouldn't be a crime at all. I would also argue that some non-violent drug crimes should not result in a prison sentence. We have to find other ways to punish people that are not prisons. And I think that prisons are for removing dangerous people from society that we don't want in society, on our streets, in the public. We have to find other ways to punish people.
I think it's really interesting that on this panel we've got a range of political views from left and right, and yet you're all kind of in the same place on this.
Yeah.
Whereas if we were doing this 30 years ago, we would have had somebody, probably you, Reem, saying, lock them up for life, let's bring back hanging and that sort of thing.
As a libertarian, I definitely do want to bring back hanging or anything.
But you know what I mean? There would have been the voice of the authoritarian right, which doesn't seem to exist so much nowadays. Interesting. But let's take a follow-up call from Jerry in St Albans. Jerry, what would you like to say?
Right. I really just want a frank answer, not kind of like, that there's no staff or anything like that. Why isn't there any rehabilitation in prison whatsoever? And I'm talking from experience, not me personally, but my son, okay? There's nothing. And then when they come out and they go to an approved premises, There's still nothing.
It's not joined up, is it?
There's no English, there's no
all
maths.
right. Well, let's go to our panel. Member of the Justice Select Committee, Mike Tapp. Why? I mean, Jerry says there's no rehabilitation. Obviously, an exaggeration. Some prisons will be better than others, but she's got a broadly correct point, hasn't she?
There is some rehabilitation, and I agree that it certainly needs to improve. And look, there's been schemes in Isle of Sheppey, for example, that links up with the college, East Kent College, and ensuring that those that are due for release are upskilling, be it in normal trades or carpentry, building, but also in other prisons they're looking at more creative arts, which is really interesting because it gives people a passion and something to leave and pursue. But the fact is, we have inherited an absolute mess, an underfunded prison service with no spaces left. So we need to get the basics right first and make sure that there's space for criminals to go into, and that's why we've committed to building 4 new prisons by 2031 with 14,000
That was
new
done
spaces.
under the previous government, of course. There was nothing new in what Shabana Mahmood was saying today. There's no extra prisons.
Well, you can judge us on our delivery, and the Conservatives have failed to deliver on these things, and we'll be working hard to do that. And look, what we inherited during the summer riots was simply unacceptable. The fact that we've been forced on early release should never happen again, and we do have answers to that, and there will be much more to come in terms of improving the rehabilitation system too, because it is really important. I agree with Jerry.
Reem, isn't the part of the key here, if you're going to rehabilitate someone, it's probably a good idea if they can read and write first, isn't it? I mean, that really is getting back to basics.
That is definitely the basics. It is what I want. I will say I don't think that everybody can be rehabilitated. There definitely are some very, very violent criminals or some people that genuinely cannot be rehabilitated. The problem that we have at the moment is, I mean, I think that Mike's absolutely right. The situation that we're in, where effectively in the summer we had about 100 spaces left, so very, very near complete overcapacity. We should never have been in that position in the first place. I don't necessarily think it's underfunding. I think it's a political problem. It's the fact that nobody wants new prisons being built in their constituencies. No member of parliament wants to go to their constituents and say, we are going to have a big prison right next to your home. Nobody wants that. So we have to have an understanding about where it's going to happen, maybe in more rural communities. Maybe we're going to actually build those areas in those constituencies. And I will say, the Labour government have said that they're going to try and relax some of the regulatory rules around where they can build prisons so that they can have sort of automated approval processes, so it's much easier to build. We absolutely need to build, I mean, not just prisons, houses. We don't build anything in this country, and I think that is a huge, huge problem economically and, of course, for prisons. But fundamentally, this also brings back to the point that we just put too many people in prison for too many different types of crime. There is no reason a non-violent criminal needs to go to prison, needs to be removed from society.
It's an interesting point you make about people don't want a prison built near them. Where I live, though the house has been completed on Friday, so I won't live there anymore, but 2 miles down the road, former RAF Coltershall, they turned that into a prison for sex offenders. No, but I mean, I didn't even know that when I moved in. In 10 years there, has that impacted on my life in that area? Not one iota. So I think that there's a lot of
initial perception, isn't it?
Exactly.
You're not going to have sex offenders roaming the streets.
Anyway, going back to rehabilitation, Joe.
Yes, going back to rehabilitation, I think the key thing is, what is the purpose of prison? And if you think it's punishment, then I think that's historically been a sort of, well, why should they have televisions? And, then you don't think that there should be a lot of investment in rehabilitation. I think we've come a long way, and clearly when we're talking about reoffending, if you don't rehabilitate whilst people are in prison, then there is no incentive for them to turn their life around, change, and they haven't got the skills necessarily. So I think it's vital. It is a matter of finance, I think. If prisons are overcrowded, then to find spare staff and spare space to have schemes is difficult. But I think that hopefully with the new prisons that are being built, it will be fundamentally built into the system that rehabilitation is as important as punishment.
Will, you touched on this in your previous answer.
Yeah.
Anything to add?
Well, there's I don't know if everyone's seen it, but I went to see this film, Sing Sing. Come across that?
Not seen it.
Fantastic movie. It's about a kind of incarceration in kind of Boston or New York or Baltimore. And it's a story about a bunch of inmates and the leadership of them, enabled by a kind of liberalish regime, who actually use theatre and and the mounting of a play as a group of prisoners, some of them very violent, actually, violent histories. It's based on a real-life story. And actually, bit by bit by bit, the act of doing this kind of, brings the group together. They learn off each other. And finally, begin one by one to get released. It's kind of inspiring, actually. If you haven't seen it, it's really worth seeing it.
Do you remember, though, in about, 2001 or something, Jack Straw was Home Secretary, and it emerged through one of the tabloids that, I think it was in Lewes Prison, they were having courses on theatre and stand-up comedy. And, of course, the tabloid said, what an utter waste of money. This is outrageous. And I thought, what a great idea this is.
Well,
because
actually,
from a prison governor's point of view, you want that sort of thing. So sort of partly to, I suppose, if there is going to be a fight, we'll use comedy to stop it.
These were men who were murderers, kind of one on death row. Incredible, actually. I mean, it is based on a life story, so it's not. It just demonstrates that actually, if you get the context right, and if you get the leadership right, and if you and the inmates, actually, it's also about converting the inmates to the cause. Yes. I mean, some kind of in prison for violent crime, learning Shakespeare isn't obvious,
Right, we need to go to a break because we've got lots more of your questions to get through. 0345 6060 973. Will is very keen to answer a question on the sale of the Observer. If anyone,
I'm answering.
Maybe nobody cares. I don't know, but they should.
Cross Question with Iain Dale. Watch live on Global Player. This is LBC.
20 past 8 on LBC. We have Labour MP Mike Tapp, former Conservative MP Joe Gideon, Reem Ibrahim from the IEA, and Will Hutton, ex-editor of The Observer. Get your questions in now. Scott,
you may have to ask the question.
We still haven't had one. I'm determined to get one before the end of the hour. Scott in West Hampstead says, the National Farmers Union chief said today that food shortages cannot be ruled out if the farmers go on strike. Another farmer at today's Westminster protest said on LBC, wake up Starmer, this isn't going to end here today. Are panel members in sympathy with the farmers, or do they think that the government is right to be tough with farmers over the proposed inheritance tax changes? Reem.
So I absolutely am sympathetic towards all of those farmers, especially those that are just above that £1 million threshold. And so they are absolutely going to have to pay that inheritance tax. I mean, I think we've got to talk about inheritance tax and call it what it is. It is absolutely a death tax. It's when you die, you are unable to then pass on your farm to the next generation of farmers. And I think that's absolutely disgraceful.
But why should farmers be treated differently from small business people?
Yes, I don't think they should. And ultimately, this budget, I think, has been one of the worst that we've seen. We've seen huge amounts of money being taken from working people, and farmers are one of them. That being said, I don't think that farmers should be getting an exemption on inheritance tax. I think inheritance tax should be abolished altogether. This particular point is really important.
Why did I know you were going to say that?
Get rid of it altogether. I don't think that farmers are special. I don't think that they should be getting an exemption, but I don't think anybody should be paying an additional tax when they die.
Will, explain to us why they should.
I do.
Assuming you believe that.
I take a diametrically opposite view to Ibrahim, actually, yeah. I think we have debated this in the past, haven't we? I can't remember, but anyway. Look, I mean, you call it a death tax, I call it a we share in your good luck tax. The numbers of people in Britain who are going to inherit £1 million or £2 million or £3 million are kind of 0.1, 0.2% of the population. And actually, no one's suggesting that we should kind of confiscate their wealth in a kind of Stalinist raid. We're saying that a proportion of that, and in the case of the farmers, it's you get £1 million of relief, and then it's a 20% kind of tax rate.
A lot of them can't afford that.
Here's my point. No, look, when this principle was kind of really codified, which was brought in by Gladstone in 1881 or 1882, he called it a succession tax. And the idea was, exactly to pick up Ian's point, that actually when, assets and wealth move from one generation to the next, you can go to the Aztecs, the Incas, the Romans, the Greeks, medieval Europe, kind of every country in Europe, as far as I know, say part of that wealth, a sliver, should actually be paid into the common pool, because wealth actually can't be exercised independently of the society of which you are part. That's the principle of inheritance tax. Once you accept the principle, farmers should have to pay it. But there should be exemptions for the proper reason that actually, we need farmers. And actually, having left the European Union and the common agricultural policy, kind of yields in farming are kind of much, much lower. It's kind of much tougher. And I would have loved it if in the run-up to 2016, the farmers had come out in the streets and said, we really, it's in our interest and it's in food security interest that we stay inside the common agricultural policy, or if we leave the European Union, we must have a similar policy. That wasn't said, and consequently we are where we are.
Well, I absolutely want to see farmers and British farming be competing with other countries across the world, and I'm very, very pro-free trade. This week we are going to enter the CPTPP, which is undoubtedly going to increase food security domestically in the UK. That being said, I think that the inheritance...
It's 0.01% of our trade, Ibrahim. Come on. I mean,
at the moment, we've not entered the CPTPP yet. Look, I hope it does.
You just said something which is factually incorrect, if I may suggest. You said all other European countries
I think there's one or two.
Sweden, which is a country that people on the left always like to cite as a sort of model of taxation and all the rest of it. They abolished their inheritance tax rate 20 years ago.
I think you'll find that there's gift taxes in Sweden, and there's other kinds of ways in which wealth transfers are taxed while you're living rather than at the moment of death. I mean, different countries come to this kind of the trigger moment for the tax is different. So I mean, just kind of
the real issue.
No, let me bring the other panelists in the room. Mike.
Yes, it's been a difficult decision for obvious reasons. But first, we've got to remember that 12,000 farms closed under the Conservative government, and there was some really difficult trade deals made. The Australia-New Zealand trade deal, which shafted, excuse my language, the farmers and left them in a really difficult position too. Now, the taxes that we've put on, the inheritance tax, is there for those with broader shoulders, and up to £3 million for couples on those estates. And it's the larger estates that will fill that. But at the same time, there's £5 billion worth of investment in sustainable farming. We're also looking at bringing down energy bills for farmers, which is really important because that's gone up significantly under the Conservatives. So there's a lot of help there for farmers too. And things aren't as bad as I think are being made out by some. I think it's been whipped up by some opposition politicians who are cosplaying as farmers, and it's quite ridiculous, some of the sites I saw today, to wind people up.
But what about when John McTernan, who's a respected Labour advisor, I'm told does advise Keir Starmer behind the scenes, he said, well, we're only doing to the farmers what Margaret Thatcher did to the miners.
Well, that's certainly not accurate. And
it feels like it to some farmers.
I haven't heard that quote, but it's certainly not accurate. And look, we're also looking at ensuring that public sector are buying British food, and that's going to help the farmers in prisons, we've just spoken about, on army bases and with the NHS as well. So these things are going to help farmers. So look, what I say to small farmers, and by the way, I have some in my constituency, I've met with them, is to talk to your accountants as well, because these aren't easy figures to work out, and then let's have more of a conversation about this, because it is being whipped up, and I think some are.
Do you not fear, and this is a horrible thing to suggest, but I've heard it said that this measure is going to come in from April 2026, that there will be farmers who decide to take their own lives in advance of April 2026 to avoid this. I mean, it's a horrible thing to even contemplate, but you can see it happening.
There's an absolute tragedy to hear that as a possibility. Look, it's difficult to comment on, really. I'd expect that,
but it's got to that level.
If taxes are leading to that, there will be deeper issues, and if anyone's feeling like that, they should be reaching out for help. I say that's mental health.
Joe Gideon.
I'm absolutely 100% behind the farmers. In my time in Parliament, I chaired the all-party parliamentary group on the National Food Strategy, and I think, to suggest that we can guarantee food security whilst penalising the producers of food in this country is absolutely ridiculous. I heard Keir Starmer's speech to the NFU and I think it was horrendous how he lied about how Labour would be supportive of farmers. You only have
Mike
to look
says they are £5 billion. I mean, it's a lot of money.
But it's
10
actually
years
about.
To pay the tax. I mean, I do think it's kind of over. It's 10 years to pay the tax, interest free. It's not exactly.
So if I may finish, so it's actually about the fact that. Farmers do not feel that the government is on their side.
But farmers never do. My father was a farmer. I mean, did he ever say to me, "Oh, I like this government; they're on my side"? No, he didn't.
Farmers never do. But the issue about land ownership, and I think this is a sort of an ideological thing by the Labour Party because they hate landowners, and the suggestion that it's just the terribly rich landowners that they want to stop. It's certainly having a different effect on smaller farmers for whom land is a tool. It's not.
But Joe, the smaller farmers won't be affected. I mean, my grandfather was a farmer. My grandfather was a farmer, and my family's had to pay inheritance tax. And some of the land that the family had to dispose of is actually now held by small farmers. I mean, it breaks things up. It gets some churn in the countryside. I find the idea that
why are the farmers so annoyed? If everything you say is true, I don't believe the NFU are deliberately stirring it up
because
unnecessarily.
Profitability in farming has sunk, and it's sunk because of the
subsidies.
The new regime outside the common agricultural policy is extraordinarily tough, and actually people should take ownership of the fact that actually having left the European Union and put nothing reasonable in its place, farming is damn tough. Now, to blame inheritance tax for it is to blame the wrong thing.
No, but we have to.
I think we've got to blame net zero.
We have to make it easier for farmers, not more difficult. And this is just, a lot of farmers have said this is the final nail in the coffin.
And family farms that have been. You say the final nail in the coffin. You've got to think of all the other nails that have actually gone in, and I want to discuss those as well.
Can I just discuss one of those many nails, which is
not about blame.
Huge swathes of regulation that are absolutely stifling farmers. The fact that in Scotland they're implementing a new piece of legislation that would mean that huge amounts of money has to now be spent on ensuring that they are effectively implementing a net zero strategy on those farms. It is absolutely ridiculous that we are subjecting British farmers to this kind of absolutely absurd regulation. What I will say is net zero is a good aim. It will happen through the private sector and it will happen through technological advancements. We mentioned the fact that farming in this country is so unproductive. Why
it's not unproductive. It is. It's the yields are very. I mean, farmers are pretty bloody good actually. And the trouble is the price they pay, the price they get, the revenues they get are kind of not commensurate with the costs they're paying, and that's the problem.
Part of it is subsidies. I mean, I'm absolutely against farming subsidies. I think that taxpayers should not be footing the bill, and this is maybe the comparison to the Thatcher's miners. The British taxpayer should not be subsidising failing industries. Now, part of the reason why British farming is failing, and I think we mentioned this earlier, energy bills are incredibly high. We know that effectively cancelling
North Sea. I think it's a wrong way of framing this.
When we open up, they cannot compete. They cannot. Of course, British farmers are brilliant, but they cannot compete. Often cannot compete with international competitors.
You're a great champion of that.
Sometimes it seems cheaper to have solar farms on your land than grow food. And I think that there is a real important case to be made for looking at land usage in the UK. If we're going to have enough food, food security means growing more, in the house, as it were. And if we're going to have enough food,
we should import
energy. We are self-sufficient in key things like milk, and we are self-sufficient in key grains. Some of the things we're not self-sufficient in, I think you can't grow here.
We should be self-sufficient. I completely agree with you. I
didn't say self-sufficient.
We should be very pro importing food from other countries that produce it more efficiently. That is the principle of free trade.
And the problem is that farmers now, if you're a wheat farmer, you get roughly the same in cash terms for a tonne of wheat now than you did when my father was farming 20 years ago. And I mean, that is not sustainable.
And equally,
we have to move on.
It's cheaper for...
Whether you like it or not.
Right.
Yes, I'm hoping we are still going to get a question on the sale of the Observer. Hint, hint. You can text a question in if you like. Do I sound desperate? Yes, I am, because we want to hear Will's views on that.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:34. The questions on the Observer are flooding in now. But isn't it interesting? All the questions tonight are coming from Kent. Alan in Dover says, here you go, Ian. What does Will Hutton think about the sale of the Observer?
It's my constituent. He's got no questions.
Wesley in Gravesend says the same. So why is this controversial? Why shouldn't the Observer be sold to Tortoise Media?
Well, first of all, it's been under the ownership of the Guardian Media Group for 30 years.
So?
It sits alongside the Guardian as two sister paper, brother paper. They're a joint brand, Guardian Observer. They reinforce each other. It's true that the Observer has been neglected by the owners over the last kind of 5, 6, 7 years, arguably earlier than that, but certainly the last 5, 6, 7 years. Notwithstanding that, it's kind of increased its market share as a Sunday paper. It makes a small profit. It probably breaks even when you take into account its share of the Guardian's cost, which it should share. And it's above all, it's in a newspaper and media landscape which is very dominated by the right. There, you can get on a Sunday, you're not only in the paper but actually online stuff for free. It's widely available. What's going to happen when it's sold is that it will go behind a paywall, and so on one day in the week, an important day in the week, an important kind of contributor to kind of liberal journalism and the national discussion will be quieter. And now that if you're the Scott Trust, and your job is to protect liberal journalism, that's a self-defeating thing to do. But here's the thing. If the new owners make a success of it, which I ardently hope they do, although it will be a kind of smaller setup than the current one, the Guardian will have invented for itself a competitor, because it'll undoubtedly kind of use its brand to kind of have a web presence, Monday to Saturday. And if it goes pear-shaped, we'll have lost a great national asset. So, when you look at it editorially in terms of liberal journalism and kind of what makes strategic sense for the Guardian, it's a decision which all the journalists at both all the journalists at the Guardian Observer kind of fiercely oppose.
But you see, isn't this where lefty journalists become conservatives, in that you don't like change, you don't like new companies coming in and innovating because you want it to be like it's always been, he said provocatively.
Well, I kind of admire Tortoise Media. I mean, I think that their podcasts are fantastic. There's a wonderful series on Elon Musk at the moment, which is worth listening to. And actually, James Harding is a kind of live wire.
That's enough sucking up to your new boss.
No. I was listening to Elon. I was listening to the podcast on Tortoise Media long before this was mooted. But and it may be a success, and I hope it is a success. You don't want anything to fail, but the way it's going to be a success could have been done under the Guardian's ownership. That's the point.
Brief comments from anyone else?
I don't have strong opinions other than I do hope it's a success going forward.
Well, we can all agree on that. Right, let's go to Chris in Croydon.
Just to express my view. A great question from Kent. Thank you.
Okay, let's go to a great question from Chris in Croydon. Chris, hi.
Oh, good evening, Ian. Good evening, panel. Yes, my question is this. As a football fan, should Keir Starmer use his influence to make FIFA accountable?
I know what you're referring
Saudi
to here.
Arabia.
Only 2 days after the Prime Minister visited Saudi Arabia and spoke of the importance of Britain's economic and diplomatic ties with the kingdom, it's now been granted the right to host the 2034 FIFA Men's World Cup. England's Football Association has said today that it has had assurances from Saudi authorities that LGBT England fans will not be arrested while attending the tournament. Mike, you're a sort of football fan. You support Arsenal, don't you?
When I have the time, Ian. Yes.
I mean, are you uncomfortable about this?
I mean, it's putting two and two together, isn't it? And not necessarily coming up with the right answer. That's how I perceive this. Keir Starmer was speaking with international partners regularly on a daily basis, and then there's going to be decisions made the day after or the day after that on many things. It doesn't mean that Keir Starmer's waded in on it. So, That's my view on it. In terms of them holding it and LGBTQ plus safety, that's really important. And there does need to be that modernisation to ensure that there is that safety there, and that is a concern.
Reem?
I would also add that it's not just LGBTQ plus people that are at risk in Saudi Arabia, it's also many other groups, and we know that, for example, racism is incredibly rife in Saudi Arabia. I've got cousins that live there, so I sort of hear first-hand experience of what it's like. I do agree with Mike. I think it's wrong to sort of suggest in any way that Sir Keir Starmer has anything to do with it physically. However, hosting the Saudi royal family with the British royal family absolutely does signal that we are friends, that we are allies, and that it is perfectly okay to hold a football game.
But we
there.
are.
Well,
and have been for many, many, many years.
Absolutely, and I think it's absolutely right that we do ensure that people that do travel to Saudi Arabia are going to be safe. I am also of the view that we shouldn't be meddling in other countries' domestic policies. I'm absolutely against the way that they've treated LGBTQ people. I'm against how they've treated women. I think that it's not our business to deal with them, and I think we've got a lot of problems domestically that we need to deal with first.
Okay, Will?
Well, I just checked for Arsenal fans. They're 1-0 up against Monaco.
we don't mention that.
But look, I mean, you can't help but agree. I mean, I think that the whole question of money in sport.
Can I just throw something else into this before you go on? Because in opposition, Keir Starmer was very critical of the Saudi regime and said all sorts of things about how he wouldn't do this, he wouldn't do that, wouldn't do the other. And yet, within his first 6 months, he goes to Saudi Arabia. And obviously, I mean, realpolitik is part of being prime minister. You have to deal with people that you might not want to. But within 6 months?
I know. I find it, I mean, it is tricky. And I'm not entirely certain, because the UAE hosted the kind of World Cup just recently, and to come back to the Middle East and all the problems about playing in 35, 40 degrees centigrade and all the rest of it kind of so quickly, I thought was a kind of I think the authorities were craven here. You have Saudi Arabia maybe give it another decade or 2 decades and give them some time also to kind of put in place mild progress towards liberalisation that
they are progressing, aren't they? They've allowed women to drive.
It is true. So I think that it would have been. So the questioner is saying, that actually. The British government should use its kind of influence, such as it has actually, and it's because football is independently managed. It's not a kind of the state doesn't have that much influence.
We'll do soon with the football regulator.
Yeah, but that'll be just UK provenance. It won't be international provenance. I do get it, and I do think that. It would have. I think it might have been better to frown rather than to kind of briefly say yes.
I hate to correct you twice, but it was Qatar which hosted the World Cup,
not
the UAE.
I beg your pardon. I so beg your pardon.
Yes, I mean, this
is
an
LBC
issue.
Verify here.
In the person of Iain Dale.
I'm worried now. Joe.
It's not just Saudi Arabia, and obviously Qatar. We've had, Olympics in Beijing and Russia, and I'm not sure that any government is able to influence the human rights policies of host countries. The issue, I suppose, has to be whether there should be a boycott of any country that offends our own sensitivities. And I think, clearly, when it comes to
where do you draw the line, though? I mean, let's say Iran got the next Olympic Games. I mean, that would be quite a ethical issue.
I think if they're actively hostile to the United Kingdom, that's where the line is drawn. And it's Saudi Arabia are actively an ally with the United Kingdom. I think Iran and China and Russia are where I draw the line. Anywhere else, I mean, we'd have to be boycotting the entire world, and that's just not feasible.
We have to be careful to separate politics from sport.
Yes, you are
that
right.
is really important, because otherwise you get bogged down on a daily basis when you're playing in different countries and taking the joy away from sport.
I mean, interesting. Russia hosted the World Cup only 6 years ago. Would we boycott a Russian-hosted World Cup now? I suspect we might.
We would, yeah.
And I mean, interesting, the Olympics, you had Russians labelled something else, able to take part, and Ukrainians. It is a very complex issue, I think. I'm not sure that you can take the politics out of sport, and it's becoming more and more complex.
OK, we'll move on in just a moment.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Union.
8:46, Mike Tapp, Labour MP for Dover, Joe Gideon, former Conservative MP, Reem Ibrahim from the Institute of Economic Affairs, and Will Hutton, Observer columnist, for the time being anyway. That was said with humour, Will, as you know. Right, let's go to
smile on
a
your
text
face.
question from James. Is it time for the public sector unions to just grow up and take the 2.8% pay rise the government is offering them? Joe?
So, I think Labour have found it quite interesting and difficult that the public sector are not happy to sort of roll over and have become empowered through above inflation-busting pay rises. The challenge is that it hasn't been the pay rises that they gave immediately upon coming into office were not linked to productivity, were not linked to any form of reform, and the real challenge for the country is if you go on giving larger pay rises to public sector bodies that the private sector can't keep up, you get inflation, the whole thing collapses, and we still have waiting lists as we had before. We still have challenges with police teaching, so is it time for them to grow up? I think it's time for there to be recognition that we need serious reform within the public sector, and that has to be led by government, and I can't see it happening.
Mike?
So I'd say firstly that the pay rises we presented when we came into government are linked to productivity. Because
no, they're not. The rail union.
So there's millions of people out of work through long-term sickness. So having doctors working will help that. Having the trains moving will also help that. We lost billions of pounds through things like ticket sales, through people not being able to reach the venues. So this is linked to certainly to the economy. But then if you look at
every wage is linked to the economy.
Then if you look at the pay body, independent pay bodies recommendations, what we've done at this moment in time is we've gone back, we've done the maths, and we've said that it looks like it's 2.8% that we can offer. But that's still got to go through review. No decision has been made yet. We've inherited a very difficult fiscal situation, so there can't be massive pay rises across the board, but in the right places.
But there have been so far. I think that's the point. And so naturally, the public sector unions think, well, we'll have a bit of that as well. Thank you very much.
They're not linked to productivity. The thing is, public sector pay has to be put into the context of public sector spending, and we are already spending huge amounts of money in the public sector. 2.8% is actually quite generous. It is above what inflation is predicted to be next year, which is 2.6%. So I think we have to have that conversation. If we want to see higher wages in the public sector, we need to see better productivity. We also need to see more efficiency. And ultimately, I think we need to think about public sector reform. We've mentioned the fact that National Health Service, we've got a huge waiting list of over 8 million. We've got huge amounts of people that are unable to get back into work. A tenth of the adult working population are on long-term sickness benefits. There is a national scandal in this country, and it's predominantly as a result of the government increasing that spending and effectively bending to the unions every single time they ask for more money. It is unacceptable for those people in the private sector that work incredibly hard. There are huge amounts of people across the British economy
but
that
there are lots of people in the public sector who work incredibly hard who haven't had much of a pay rise for a very long time.
That's absolutely true, but we need to have a conversation about productivity. We need to have a conversation about where the money is coming from. We can't keep taxing the productive side of the public sector, so the private sector, to pay for then the public sector. It's just not. It's not feasible, not sustainable.
Will, I suspect you're not going to agree with Reem on this one.
Where do I start? I mean, first of all, I think the concept of pay review bodies is rather good, and I'm a little concerned, Mike, that actually the government is trying to clip their wings, because the pay review bodies take into account the kind of are invited to take into account the overall fiscal position, as well as looking at questions about retention and hiring, morale, and also productivity. I mean, they're very, and actually the recommendations they make are, pretty considered. And actually to say, well, actually, you can forget all that, guys. You're just going to get, all you can do is offer 2.8%. Seems to me to be an inappropriate position. I would have preferred if that had been a kind of advice that was given to the peer review bodies for them to take into account.
It's really important.
Rather than a directive.
We can't bury our head in the sand at what we've inherited here, so it's important to lay out the position clearly.
The state is unsustainable.
One at a time.
Of course. But, there may be parts of the public sector where actually there's a conversation to be had about performance and about productivity, and actually the peer review body hears it and says, well, I think, given everything into it, we could pay 3.5%, we could pay 4%, or there could maybe ways in which we could kind of organise this so that we can deal with some of the retention and recruitment issues that actually are problematic. And actually, just to say 2.8% as a flat directive, I thought was over the top, actually. That said, and here again, I challenge you, Joe, and the idea that that actually you make a pay settlement when the government first comes in July, and by the first weeks of December there should be kind of transformation in kind of 100 days. It's kind of ludicrous. It's going to take these things will take time to bed in. And I do think actually, and I was talking to some primary school teachers earlier over the weekend. Some of the things, what's going on in classrooms and the stress and kind of incredible kind of kids that are mute, kids that kind of are hungry, kids that actually kind of just have profound learning difficulties in the same class as other kids who've got, and you're kind of indifferently paid at primary school teacher. I just think you've got some awareness of actually how important these parts of the public sector are. A teacher, a nurse, what they face on a daily basis is amazing.
So absolutely nobody is saying that teachers aren't incredible, that people who work in the NHS aren't incredible.
But don't pay them then. Refuse to pay them.
That's a nonsense. But people who work in the private sector are also incredible.
That's true.
Quite often, and they have to be paid according to they have to cut their cloth according to the means. If the money isn't there, then they can't get bonuses. They can't get extra pay. So the idea that you don't value somebody if you can't give them double-digit pay rises. It's just a nonsense.
No one's talking about double-digit pay rises.
Whatever.
Well, some unions have been talking about double-digit pay rises. That's the problem. Now, listen, we've got time to fit one more question, and I want to give this a bit of an airing. So Olive in Leeds says, Sir Elton John has hit out at the legalisation of marijuana in Canada and parts of the US, calling it one of the greatest mistakes of all time. Is he right?
No.
Now, well, just a second. He says marijuana is addictive. It leads to other drugs, and that people who have smoked it don't think normally. He got clean from drugs, including marijuana, at the start of the 1990s, and has since helped other performers, including Robbie Williams and Eminem, overcome addictions. Go on then, Reem.
We absolutely should legalise marijuana in this country. I've just come back from Canada about 3 weeks ago, actually, and
I thought you seemed a bit spacey.
Well, I had a bit of fun there too. I will neither confirm nor deny if I dabbled.
I think you just did.
Well, what I will say is that I think that these kind of crimes should not. This sort of goes back to our initial question about prisons. Why should it be illegal for somebody to take a drug that we know is not as harmful as other things? Marijuana is definitely less harmful than some legal substances like alcohol, and yet there is significantly less.
Well, the marijuana of my youth might have been, but the marijuana of today isn't.
And the reason for that is because it's illegal. If we legalise it, we can regulate it, we can tax it, we can ensure it's being produced by a taxed and regulated private sector rather than by criminal gangs, which is the current system. Just because something is illegal doesn't mean it doesn't end up on the streets. Okay. We all know weed is everywhere in this country.
Joe?
By the way, just to say, I agree with it.
Hang on.
No, it hasn't been the case. It hasn't been the case.
So I'm a bit ambivalent on this. As you say, marijuana in my day was allegedly was quite mild and wasn't as strong. But nowadays, is it skunk?
Did you ever try it?
I didn't. I'm a really boring person. I didn't even try smoking.
We're so similar in so many ways.
I guess I sat in a room where it was wafting through the air, so maybe I
can't even smell it. It's prevalent in London. I can't. People say, can't you smell it in Leicester Square? No, I can't.
Well,
I don't know why.
I can definitely smell it.
But people do say it's the gateway to to Class A drugs. And, I saw as the MP in Stoke the devastating effect of, there was a thing called monkey dust, which is a kind of hallucinogenic, which had crippling effects. Now, I would need to be convinced that it isn't
right, so you're firmly on the
gateway
fence.
thing. I'm absolutely firmly on the fence, yeah.
Well, I agree with Ibrahim. I think that that actually...
No, that's her surname. Reem is her.
Another mistake from me.
3 strikes and you're out, Will.
I'll just retire gracefully, actually. But I do think that the point is well made. I mean, that actually... not just marijuana, actually, but kind of all these drugs kind of require to be kind of, inspected, regulated. I mean,
crack,
all of it. I mean, I would
decriminalise it. I wouldn't.
You criminalise. Some things you criminalise, but actually, what the kids are taking is kind of, mad.
But it's produced by criminals. This is the point.
I'm not sure that marijuana is the most serious. Actually, I mean, some of the drugs you take in some of the clubs are really kind of screw you up.
And they are so easily available. I mean, that's the point. Just because it's illegal under the law doesn't mean it doesn't exist in a huge black market.
Okay, Mike.
It's a difficult one. I think on balance, I understand the arguments for legalising, which are predominantly around safety and also cutting out some of the criminal gangs. But a big argument is that it's less harmful than many other drugs. And I think the fact that it's harmful is enough for me to just about fall on the side of not legalising
Should we ban alcohol?
Well, look, if alcohol was discovered now, it probably would not be legal. It'd probably be quite a high-class drug because it can be very damaging. And look at
prohibition in the
Should we ban everything? Should we ban damaging? Should we ban sugar?
We certainly should not ban alcohol. But what I'm saying is, I've no doubt if it was discovered now, it would not be quite as liberal as we are around it. So
I'm not sure about that. Wine has been a fabulous thing.
Let's move on to our fun question. Izzy in Bristol says, Lego is apparently the most wanted Christmas toy among kids in Britain this year. But what was your most memorable childhood Christmas present? Reem.
Well, I grew up Muslim, so I got no Christmas presents, except for a lovely bag of sweets by my primary school teacher. So I have no favourite because I only had one.
So you don't celebrate Christmas at all?
No, I mean, I do now. I'm actually this year going to celebrate it with my boyfriend for the first time. Yes, which I'm very excited about. But other than that, I've never celebrated Christmas because I grew up in a Muslim family. Multicultural Britain, there you go.
Mike?
Probably a bike.
Ooh.
Chopper.
It was horrible.
A bit too young.
It was lime green. It was I was very excited by that. But I was battling between that and Nintendo. Action Man as well was quite exciting.
Okay, Joe?
So I love ballet, and I had this tiny little ballerina. When you put her in front of a mirror, she did pirouettes. And it was a sort of magnet, but it was really clever.
Okay, Will?
Well, both my grandsons, actually, I've got actually 3 grandsons, but both grandsons wanted a Lego Starship kit. That's kind of a big deal, actually.
It's always my favourite present. I still have my Lego set.
I'm quite struck by the kind of popularity of Lego. I slightly older than the rest of you, used to get Airfix kits, Airfix models. And they were great. You could build Lancaster bombers, Spitfires. So I kind of, the days after Christmas was about assembling
because that's the thing.
Remnants of the Second World War. That was what
the 3 of us grew up in an era when everything was still dominated by the aftermath of the Second World War. And I remember the games that we'd play in the playground at school were all British Bulldog, sort of people would run around pretending to be Spitfires. And it was a totally different era, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Anyway, on that note of reminiscence...
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
9:04. Welcome to the programme if you've just joined us. Now, halfway through the afternoon, Chris, my producer, sends me a list of subjects that he thinks I might want to talk about on the programme. There's a long list today, probably about 12 different ideas for phone-ins. And I then phoned him and Corey and I said, I want to talk about this medical misogyny story, which I think surprised both of them when I picked that one, because I think it is quite an interesting area, the Women and Equalities Committee of MPs have said today that women and girls with reproductive conditions are enduring years of pain because of what they term medical misogyny. Now, their conditions are frequently dismissed due to what they call pervasive stigma and a lack of education surrounding common conditions, including, these are words I find great difficulty in pronouncing, endometriosis, heavy periods, and adenomyosis. That's according to this committee of MPs. Now, they say the symptoms are often normalised, and it can take years for women with reproductive conditions to get a diagnosis and care in England. Now, women are being left to endure pain and uncomfortable and discomfort that interferes, this is a quote, with every aspect of their daily lives, leading many to seek private care. The MPs suggest there's a lack of medical research, treatment options and specialists, coupled with the deprioritisation of gynecological care, where waiting lists have grown faster than any other speciality. Now, if all of that is true, and it is a select committee of MPs, so let's assume it is, I mean, that is a disgrace that women are being effectively victimised in this way. Now, when I saw this term, medical misogyny, I thought, oh, here we go again, evil men. But it's not quite as simple as that when you actually look into the story. I mean, I'm sure there are GPs, I'm sure there are doctors in hospitals who are misogynists, just as there are in every walk of life. I mean, why should the healthcare profession be any different from anywhere else? There are always going to be people who display misogynistic attitudes, but is the system set up to fail women? That's what I want to really ask here. I want to know if you feel, as a woman, that you've been a victim of this so-called medical misogyny, and if you work in the health service, in whatever part of it, is this a phenomenon that you recognise? Do you welcome the fact that these MPs are raising this so we can actually have a public debate about it? And the fact that they've coined this term, medical misogyny, frankly, I don't think we would be talking about it if they hadn't called it that. I don't think that anyone in the media, if they'd called it something sort of rather boring, would have been talking about it in any meaningful way at all. And yet virtually every programme on LBC today has talked about it. It's in all of the papers as well. So whoever coined this phrase, pat on the back to them, because I think it is important. So I thought, well, what should we do today? Let's talk about it, but let's talk to somebody who knows what she's talking about on this issue rather than me mouthing off about it all the time. And Dr. Ellie Cannon joins us, resident GP for the Mail on Sunday, who is a practising NHS GP in North London. Ellie, have I said anything there that you disagree with?
No, not at all.
Just wait. But is this, I mean, had you not seen this story today, is this something that you would have thought, yeah, that is a phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, I already thought we were dealing with this. So very happy that the Select Committee have brought this up in the last couple of days. But I did think we were already dealing with this. We appointed a Women's Health Ambassador, Women's Health Czar, I think 3 or 4 years ago, to deal with this type of thing, to deal with waiting lists, to deal with medical misogyny, as you say. There is a lack of women subjects in research, for example. So as an example, when painkillers are tested, they tend to be tested on sort of 70-kilo men as opposed to women. So we don't know whether or not, just because they are, because men tend to go forward for medical research. A lot of research is done on men. There's no sort of, very little research is done on pregnant women, for example. So there's lots of areas, there's sort of areas like that, research where women are sort of left behind. Then what you described in terms of sort of periods and things like that, the trouble is that women have periods, and period pain has always been considered to be a normal phenomenon, which is why you've got this sort of ingrained stigma whereby women who have bad period pain, which stops them working, stops them having relationships, stops them enjoying their life, it's not sort of taken seriously, it hasn't historically, because people think, well, all women have period pain, that's fine, or all women bleed, so that's fine. So this is the sort of issue, it's a sort of normal phenomenon that becomes abnormal, and then the women aren't taken seriously.
Oh, the period pain issue, I think, is a genuinely interesting one, because I think unless you've encountered somebody who experiences really traumatic period pains, I mean, are way away from the normal, you have no idea. One of my former producers, she wouldn't mind me saying this, I mean, literally once a month, she would actually warn me and say, look, it's about to come on, be prepared for some angry words or whatever. And I'd never sort of, I mean, as a man, I'd never thought about that too much before, because as a man, I know that women have periods every month. I know that it can be painful. But how can you possibly relate to it if you've never gone through it yourself?
And I think also as a woman who, say, has periods which are fine, say are not painful or not too heavy, I think it's also hard for female healthcare professionals to also understand that in the same way that you just said it's hard, because there's a lot of women who don't go through that. So this sort of ingrained misunderstanding is not just from men. It's very important that I say that.
How different are these issues from, for example, mental health, where I think there is a real problem with GPs not having a great understanding of mental health in the way that they do of physical health conditions. Is it really any different to that? I mean, we're talking about this term medical misogyny. Isn't it just a lack of understanding? It's not misogyny.
Well, I think in terms of women's health, there is a lot of different aspects. So as I say, there's the research side of things. There are issues with, you mentioned endometriosis. There's an issue with endometriosis whereby the diagnosis for endometriosis takes absolutely ages. And the reason it takes ages is you can really only diagnose it by having an operation. So many women don't want to go through that. Many doctors don't want to refer for that. You know, there's lots of different aspects to women's health that means there's sort of still far too much stigma involved in it. Women are not very good, and men are also not very good at talking about their genitals, talking about reproduction, talking about sex, where a lot of these symptoms come from. It's still sort of stigmatized, considered, you know, maybe sort of embarrassing and shameful, particularly amongst older women, so they're sort of not going to talk about that. So I think there's lots and lots of different things. But yes, we could talk about mental health in the same way, absolutely.
However, the health sector, it seems to me that I don't know what the proportion of male to female GPs is. I don't know what the proportion of female to male consultants is, but I suspect that in percentage terms, there are many, many more female GPs now than there were 10 or 20 years ago. And are we saying here, do you think this committee is saying that the medical profession is too dominated by men and they don't understand these things, so therefore we have to call it misogynistic?
No, I don't think this is a problem from men. I think this is a problem from the system and from the whole situation. And as I say, I think a woman who has had a normal pregnancy, got pregnant easily, not particularly had a lot of period pain, always managed to get to work when she's got her periods, is also not necessarily going to be as empathetic as she could be. So I don't think this issue just comes from men. And also the issues, as I've said, amongst research and delays in diagnosis and access to scanning, that's across the board, whatever gender your GP is.
Because when I saw this and saw this term medical misogyny, my hackles started to, I'm going to be totally honest, my hackles started to go up. Because I was thinking, well, there's plenty of examples in the other direction where you look at the amount of money that goes into breast cancer research compared to prostate cancer research. More men get prostate cancer than women get breast cancer, I'm told. So you could argue that's the opposite of being misogynistic. What is the opposite of misogynistic? It begins with A, doesn't it? That's the one. And yeah, okay.
Something.
Yeah, people know what we mean. I mean, I'm not really making that as a sort of counterbalancing point, but it's so easy to fall into a situation where, in today's society, where men are often to blame, or often the culprits for things that go terribly wrong, whether it's to do with medical things or other parts of society. But that's why I sort of initially thought this was a very misleading term.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I mean, cancer as an example that you brought up, is a great example where, for whatever reason, there are cancers that we talk about and we fundraise for, and there are cancers that we just don't. And, breast cancer, thankfully, the survival rates show this. They've improved so much. Just in my own lifetime, they've changed so much. And that's thanks to awareness and research and everything else. And you're absolutely right. We have not seen that in other cancers. And, prostate cancer, we don't have a good screen. We have this screening test for prostate cancer, PSA, which we talk about. We don't screen across the country for it. So yeah, you could say, well, there's stigma there, and it's sort of similar. I think the problem with women's health is there are so many aspects where this happens. And sadly, we also know from big reports that come out, like the Ockenden report into sort of maternity care, and sadly what you've covered in the last couple of days on LBC about what's happened to families who've gone through miscarriage and stillbirth. We sort of know that there have been these enormous cases and terrible cases where, unfortunately, women's voices have not been heard.
Harry says women are waiting 9 years for a diagnosis. He doesn't say what for, but presumably means cancer.
I think he's meaning
9 years.
Well, the average is always said as 7, and that's because a woman would go to the doctor with painful periods, sort of try a few things, and then in order to get the investigations, that can take time. It's not going to take 7 years, but it does take time to get those investigations because, as I say, for endometriosis, the investigation is actually an operation.
And I actually don't know what endometriosis is. Just explain what it is.
So the endometrium is the lining of the womb, and it's a really unusual condition actually pathologically. It's not uncommon, but it's sort of strange pathologically in that the lining of the womb, the endometrium, actually grows in pockets in other places around the body. And that becomes, so you can get sort of pockets of endometrium on the ovaries, on the bowel, in the abdomen. It's I can't think of any other condition which sort of mimics that. It's very unusual. And that causes tremendous pain. And it doesn't just cause pain during periods, it also causes pain, for example, when people go to the loo or when they have sex and at all other times.
Because there's all sorts of things that if you have pain in a part of your body, it could be any number of things. And therefore, I suppose inevitably it's quite difficult to diagnose. When I had my gallbladder issues in the summer, I thought it was food poisoning. And it was only like 48 hours later I went to A&E, and they immediately diagnosed what it was. I thought, oh, really? But it could have been any number of things. Well, look, Ellie is going to stay with us for the whole hour, so you can ask her any question you like on this whole idea of medical misogyny. Have you experienced anything that you think would come under that category? Do you think that women's issues are understood well enough, not just in the medical profession, but also, I suppose, by people like me, which I've just demonstrated I don't know enough because I didn't know what endometriosis was, let alone how to pronounce it. By the way, misandry is the word that we were looking for.
Oh, misandry.
Not a word that you hear very often, is it?
Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
9:20 on LBC. Dr. Ellie Cannon is with me, resident GP for the Mail on Sunday and a practising NHS GP in North London. Before we go to calls, and the number to call if you want to talk to Ellie is 0345 6060 973. What are the most common issues that you deal with your female patients?
Well, there's all the issues that everybody gets. So obviously women get all of those things as well. But then I suppose general issues like contraception, pregnancy, menopause, none of which are illnesses, obviously, but very common for a GP to see. Lots of things about periods, people wanting to get pregnant, pain, all sorts of things. I don't know,
How often do you get surprised?
Generally.
Well, no, I just mean somebody comes in with something that, I've never dealt with that before.
Yes, I mean, that's really, that's just the beauty of general practice. That's one of the reasons why I love being a GP, because we deal with all sorts of things week in, week out. But yeah, I don't know how often I sort of get surprised now. I mean, I've been a GP for 18 years near on, so I suppose I've seen quite a lot of things, but yeah, you get surprised by people.
Text here from Caroline, who says the medical establishment has always been institutionally sexist against women. Maybe recognition of this will finally lead to women's health conditions being given equal research funding as men's, because that disparity and inequality is at the heart of this issue. How can doctors treat women's health issues when there is such little medical research and therefore lack of treatments for them? It's straightforward sex discrimination, and it's high time this changed. It's not necessarily misogyny, but it is absolutely institutional sex discrimination. I'm not sure what the difference is there, but I mean, do you agree with Caroline there?
I mean, what that makes me think of is when we talk about conditions that affect everybody. So if we talk about something like heart disease, so if I said to you, imagine somebody having a heart attack, we all imagine the sort of public health posters of the man, you know, with a big tummy clutching his chest. And so that's been our sort of impression of what a heart attack feels like for years and years. And actually, we know that when women have a heart attack, they actually have quite different symptoms. They can get chest up into their throat and their jaw. They don't necessarily feel the crushing pain like that. So, you know, that's sort of another example of, I suppose, the sexism, is that there are actually conditions which affect both sexes, but the women's side of things, and we know women don't present with heart disease early enough, the women's side of things gets a bit ignored.
0345 6060 973 if you'd like to talk about anything to do with this report today on so-called medical misogyny or your experience of women's healthcare. Why do you think it doesn't, according to Caroline there, get the priority that a lot of men's conditions does? Lisa is a new caller in Newquay. Hello, Lisa.
Hi, Ian.
Hi, what would you like to say?
I just want to put the point of view over that it's not just reproductive health that's mishandled when it comes to women. I went in with, I got took from ambulance for a BMX track to A&E, and they sent me home with a sprained knee. I told them I couldn't walk, that it wasn't right, but they're like, oh no, you've just sprained it. Used all my savings at that point to go private to get a scan, and it turned out I had no ligaments left. I had completely tore all the ligaments in my leg.
Wow. Why do you think that, I mean, how do you relate that to being a woman?
They didn't believe me when I told them how bad the pain was. I told them I was up to like an 8 and a 9, and they were like, oh no, it was on the pain factor scale, that, you know, that's up to a 10. Yeah, they just generally don't believe.
You think they didn't believe you because you were a woman?
Yes.
Ellie, could that be the case?
I mean, look, obviously, every case is different and is individual. I suppose one can't say that was because you were a woman at that time. I do agree with you. It is not just an issue amongst reproductive health. It's also an issue across the board, as we've said, amongst other things. For example, things like sort of heart disease, where women are diagnosed later than men. And I think pain has been an issue within this area, which I know is mentioned in the Select Committee, where women sort of talking about pain are sort of not taken as seriously as they should be. But obviously we can't say in this sort of one moment for Lisa whether it was because she was a woman at that time.
And Lisa, do you have a female GP? Do you prefer to have a female GP?
Now I have a good rapport with my GP, but it did take a while to find a new GP when I moved, because I moved down from Scotland. So actually I've got a male
Lisa.
GP now.
It is traumatic, isn't it, finding a new GP? I've just had to go through that process after having had the same GP since 1992. She suddenly announced she was retiring, and I thought, how dare you?
How rude.
Very rude. Lisa, thank you very much indeed. That is an issue, though, isn't it? I mean, veering off the subject for a minute, because because I'd had a female GP for 30 odd years, I sort of immediately wanted another one for no logic at all, actually. But I suppose we all have our
I think there is some logic in that, though, because you'd got used to talking about your health with one particular type of person. And also, we know absolutely from research that having the same doctor consistently is really good for your health.
Yeah, because you see this new surgery that I've gone to, I think they rotate.
No.
So I haven't actually got a named one, but I'm going to try and get one. But I'm not sure I'm going to succeed on it.
I'm very lucky because I've worked in the same practice for 16 years. And it's very good for doctors as well to see patients who we're familiar with. It's obviously just makes our sort of work as a doctor a lot easier as well.
Right, another text here. My 19-year-old daughter has had abdominal pain for 4 years and hospitalised overnight pain because the pain was so bad. It turns out she might have polycystic ovaries.
Yeah.
She had tests, but the doctor now says she has to wait 8 years for a formal diagnosis of polycystic ovaries, as it can just be periods being irregular.
No, so this is all wrong. So this, they have to go back to the doctor. This is all wrong. So I think one of the problems with the constant discussion in the media and even from the politicians, and I got very angry when the new Labour government talk about the NHS being broken, is it means that people like this who've texted in think it's okay that you're going to be waiting for years. Nobody in the NHS is waiting for 8 years on a waiting list. Waiting lists are long, but they are definitely not that long. And the trouble with this constant narrative, the NHS is broken, is people think that's normal. That is not normal. So there's something gone wrong there. Polycystic ovarian syndrome can be diagnosed by a GP with blood tests and with scans. So there's no waiting list for that. And even if you were waiting for the slowest hospital for a gynecology appointment, I think you would be waiting up to a year, maybe 18 months. Somebody can tell me they've waited 18 months and prove it. This is not correct. I'm not happy with this at all.
I don't ask whether it was a male GP that gave that diagnosis, but there we go. Ian says, for decades, medicines were tested on male cells because women's... hang on, I'm just going to put this onto a slightly different screen so it's easier for me to read. For decades, medicines were tested on male cells because women's changing hormones affected test results. In 2015, to see if it was safe to take with alcohol, one female Viagra drug... Female Viagra, does that exist?
No, they've talked about it for a long time.
Goodness
it doesn't really
me.
exist.
Mind boggles. Not only the mind. No, don't go there, don't go there. Let's start that again. To see if it was safe to take with alcohol, one female Viagra drug was tested on 25 people, 23 of whom were men. You will often see that dosage instructions for women, the same dosage as men, were twice as high as they should be. This was because the fat-soluble medication persisted in women's bodies for much longer. Women have more body fat. They then take more than necessary because the last dose hadn't left their body. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Women do have more body fat. That's why women tend to respond to alcohol differently. And I'm not sure about those figures sort of quoted there, but absolutely, if you look at sort of medical research and how it's done, more often than not, it is done on men. And it certainly has been historically. And obviously, a lot of medicine we use is because we've used it for decades and decades. So it has always been tested on men. And it is sort of very standardised as opposed to being tested on women.
OK, Dr Ellie Cannon is with us for the next half an hour, taking your calls and texts, 0345 6060 973. Let's explore this further. Do you feel that women are discriminated against in our health system? And if so, how and why, and what can be done about it?
Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
9:33 on LBC. Dr Ellie Cannon is here, resident GP for the Mail on Sunday. We're talking about this Women and Equalities Committee report, which uses the term medical misogyny, and they are talking about it in regard to women's reproductive care and saying that there are lots of problems that women encounter in this area. and they've called it misogyny. I mean, we've had a long discussion about that, so we don't need to go into whether it is or it isn't. But what I'd like to do over the next half an hour with Dr. Ellie Cannon, who's with me, is to explore a little bit more about the women's healthcare treatment and whether there are things that could be done to maybe make it a little fairer. Is that the right word? I don't know. 0345 6060 973. What have been your experiences of healthcare? Do you think it makes a difference if you have a female GP or a male GP? If you're about to undergo an operation and you're a woman, do you sort of almost heave an inner sigh of relief if you see that the surgeon is female, for example? I mean, in theory, it shouldn't matter, should it? But we're all human beings. We all have different ideas of what we feel more comfortable with. I feel more comfortable with a female GP than a male GP. There is no logic to that apart from the fact that I'm used to a female GP and I don't like change. For me, it's that simple. But you may have had different experiences here. Let's talk to Tammy in Hailsham in East Sussex. Hello, Tammy.
Hi.
What would you like to say?
Well, I'd like to sort of just talk about my daughter's experience. I mean, she's now 31. She always had sort of pretty painful periods, which we initially sort of thought, well, you just put up with it, blah, blah, blah. And then we kept going back to the doctors and, with the pain and talking about it. And again, the doctors just said, well, this is what you have to put up with. At 16, she was referred to a psychiatrist, can you believe it, because they thought it was in her mind, the pain, which you can imagine what that did to a 16-year-old. And, she duly went along and, I don't know, it was horrendous, really. And then nobody was listening to her, nobody was listening to me. And then at 18, a consultant, she was referred to a consultant who reluctantly agreed to do a laparoscopy, but basically actually said to her, I don't think I'm going to find anything, but, we'll do it. She had the laparoscopy and she had sort of level 4 endo, which is, pretty bad. It was attached to her bowel, it was attached to her bladder. So they sort of tried to sort of get rid of what they could. And, when she came round from it, he actually did apologise and said, I'm really sorry. Yes, you have got this. And then in the same breath, he said, I don't think you're going to be able to have children, because one of her tubes had burst as well because of the endo. And she was sort of just coming out of the anaesthetic at the age of 18, being told this by this consultant, and I always remember she rang me, and she was just hysterical. It was just awful the way the whole thing had been dealt with. And I mean, to be able to tell an 18-year-old, well, I don't think you're going to be able to have children when you're coming out of a general anaesthetic, it was honestly, it was awful. And then actually after that, she still had to battle to sort of get anything done about it. But luckily she lives in Bristol now. And I think, I might be wrong, but they've just fairly recently opened up a clinic just for endo. And she went for a procedure there about a year ago. And she said it was wonderful because it was all female. Everybody knew what endo was. She didn't have to sort of start again and explain what it was and blah, blah, blah. And also all the other women there were having sort of same treatment. So she could actually sit and talk to other females about it. But honestly, as you know, 1 in 5 women have endo, but that seems to sort of excuse the treatment that these poor girls are going through. And most of the time it does lead to infertility or real problems with having children, but that's only half of it. I mean, now she has to carry a little card around with her because it's affected her bladder, that, if she has to go to the loo, she has to go to the loo.
Yeah.
So it's just all the way she's been treated, like so many other women I've heard, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better. We're talking about it more, but people are still not being listened to, still not being understood. And I don't think it really does make a difference if it's a male or a female at the end of the day, I really don't. But I think that's right, Tammy.
Yeah, that's obviously sort of devastating what your daughter's gone through, but it's good to hear that she's found a good clinic now. And I think if women aren't listened to, which we've been talking about, the group who are listened to even less are teenage girls. And I think that's unfortunately what you've described, somebody sort of describing period pain when they're 14, 15 or 16. Unfortunately, we have a habit as adults of not listening to teenagers, not listening to young people. And, obviously I knew how that story was going to go with the laparoscopy and the endometriosis. It's classic situation.
Absolutely.
And I think we have to get much better at listening to women, even when they're young women, as teenagers. And I think what you've said really speaks to what I was sort of trying to explain earlier, which is that endometriosis is a common condition, but medically speaking, it's quite unusual. It's an odd condition to have when parts of your body are sort of found in different places. And as you said, she has to have her bladder card because it affects her going to the toilet. These are all sort of quite shameful or embarrassing things for a young woman. And I think there's a very big community now online of women with endometriosis who are very supportive to each other.
Tammy, did I hear you right? You said 1 in 5 women have this.
Yeah. 1 in 5 women have endometriosis to some extent or the other. I mean,
to some extent.
But that's the thing. You say 1 in 5 people have it. Oh well, it's not that bad, or what? And it just gets a little bit sort of dismissed. But it's also the devastating consequences, because it's also the sexual side of it as well.
Yeah.
It's when you're a young woman, it's very painful sometimes to have. It's a mental side of it more than anything as well. And when you're being dismissed and told it's in your mind, which I know she's not alone in that. But I just wish, as you said, rightly so, it needs to be looked at when you are younger, because that's when it obviously starts. And if you have to sort of. And then you might not realise you have sort of infertility problems until you're much older, and it's almost too late. She's lucky in some ways that she knows that those sort of implications, and that she probably can't have children, so she can deal with it mentally now. But I don't know. I just feel that we talk a lot about it. But maybe hopefully it will happen like with the menopause. We talked a lot about it, and finally things are happening. But
Tammy,
I think.
Sorry, go on. You were about to say something else.
I was going to say, I think, if I'm not mistaken as well, I'm not sure, but I think endometriosis has now become sort of not a handicap, a disability. I think you can. So from a work point of view, your employer has to sort of look at it as a disability. So if you need to have time off and things, which is a huge step forward as well.
Absolutely. But as you rightly say, what needs to change is not just talking about it, but actually is the access to the laparoscopy, which is what your daughter had for diagnosis, and actually the access and the care. That's what needs to change.
Tammy, what a great call. Thank you very much indeed. But you've made me feel really guilty, because I'm thinking if 1 in 5 women have this, and I said at the beginning of the programme I didn't know what it was, I feel completely ignorant. I mean, I don't now because you've explained what it is. But I suspect that many of the men listening to this won't have known what it was either.
I think that's right, because I think if women suffer with this, and you sort of wanted to give a headline, and the headline would be, I have, very bad pain during my periods, and at other times, for example, when I'm having sex. I don't think it's the sort of thing people would be talking about openly.
And this other condition that they talk about in the report, which I can't pronounce, adenomyosis.
Adenomyosis.
What is
it's
that?
Quite similar. So that's when another part of the womb actually grows in a different place.
Adenoids.
Different place. Anything adeno is to do with glands.
Right.
So it's when a different part of the womb grows in another part. So again, causes a huge amount of pain and is actually slightly harder to treat and harder to diagnose. But they're often lumped together because they're the tissue in the wrong place.
Right. Annie in Carnforth is on the line. Hello, Annie.
Oh, hello, Ian. Well, nobody's mentioned patronising language, which some male doctors, definitely not all of them, but if I had £1 for every time a very patronising male doctors call me dear, not just when I'm my age now, because, I'm 69 and I think ages and that you do get called sweetie and dear, and that drives me around the bend. But
I'd have thought you at least deserved a love, Annie.
Pardon?
I thought you'd have at least deserved a love.
Yeah. Well, honestly, I've had so many times, a doctor once said to me when I'd had 5 operations on my arm which weren't successful, he said, well, my dear, you've had a very serious accident. You can't expect that we'd get it right all at once. And I was only 21 then, and I went for a second opinion to another doctor altogether, and they'd made a complete mess of it in this one hospital. But, it's just the way doctors can talk in a very patronising way towards women. And I've had that a lot. I mean, I had it recently as well. I had what do you call them? The people who, oh my God, my brain's gone at this time. Doctors that look after your bowels and things. What's the word for them?
Gastroenterologist.
Yes, one of those. Who just said dear in every sentence, and it was on the tip of my tongue to say, will you stop calling me dear, please, and patronising me. But you can't, because there's that power relationship that goes on between, and it's awkward, and you feel, they're the ones with all the power and you're not. And there was some research done that I remember hearing on the radio, this is a good few years ago now, which I thought was interesting, that female doctors do more tests for women patients than male doctors do.
Okay.
Which I think is really interesting. Having said that, we do have a male doctor at the moment who is our named doctor, and he is very good and he does do lots of tests. But that's an interesting, bit of research.
Yeah, possibly.
Because I think female doctors might take women more seriously than some male doctors do.
Well, I don't know if I mean, obviously with your experience in the language, I sort of understand that is not right. And I think, that shouldn't be happening. I think another thing about the language, which is very interesting, and this goes back to talking about sort of stigmatising issues, and this is something that women's health charities really try and campaign on, is the language we use for our reproductive organs for both men and women. So
Time for a break.
So I have women coming to see me who tell me they have a problem down there, and then it takes quite a while to establish where down there is.
Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it?
Well, it's not, because there's lots of different parts down there.
But nobody likes talking about down there to a complete stranger. And I mean, unless you've got a good long-term friendly relationship with your GP, I mean, it's awkward, isn't it?
Well,
whether you're a woman or a man, it doesn't really matter. It's still awkward.
But language really helps people to advocate for themselves, obviously. So if you're actually able to say where something hurts, where you're bleeding from. Sometimes women have difficulty telling me where they're bleeding from exactly. So these sorts of things, you have to be able to say these things. We have to use proper language with young children so they get used, so they can advocate for themselves as they get older.
But if a patient comes into your surgery, whether it's male or female, and they start using sort of this quite cryptic language, what do you do then? Do you then say, use colloquial language for the different bits down there, or do you use the proper words?
Well, I judge it on the situation and try and establish sort of which area we are talking about. But yeah, it would be more helpful if people could use proper language. I mean, look, doctors are guilty of doing that as well. But it's, we use euphemisms like waterworks rather than saying bladder. I mean, we do that, but it would be much better if we all used proper language.
And we've got through 2 minutes of talking about down there without using any strange word or proper word or colloquial word. I think it is time for a break, isn't it?
Iain Dale on LBC.
10 to 10 on LBC, 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to talk to Dr. Ellie Cannon. Maxine says, oh no, see, I've made a mistake there because it says Maxine and then it says Anon. So I'm sorry, Maxine, it's entirely my fault. I'm going to go to the next one. Matt in Bromley says, my wife spent years going to GPs with agonising pain to be told it was normal or had mild kidney stones. Eventually, after being ambulanced in, they told her she needed her appendix removed straight away. It was only during the operation they found out there was nothing wrong with her appendix and she had severe endometriosis.
Yeah.
Is that common?
I mean, I think that's a very typical story, unfortunately, of somebody with endometriosis where the pain has been diminished by the medical establishment and she has ended up being wrongly diagnosed. And I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier, that period pain to an extent is normal. And therefore, when women have spoken historically about their pain, unfortunately, they have been belittled.
Right, another message here. Lipedema is almost exclusively a woman's condition. It's completely under-researched and doesn't seem to be common knowledge amongst medical professionals, including some doctors. Women with this very real chronic progressive condition which threatens mobility often feel ignored or even blamed as it's regularly mistaken for normal fat. This is definitely an area where women are being let down.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, lipedema is a very, very distressing condition where people get fat deposited on the lower half of their body and yes, as often mistaken for obesity. Very few treatments around, very few clinics around, misunderstood. It goes with a lot of pain.
And is it just women that have this?
Yes, I think it is mostly women, actually. It's not just women, but it's mostly women.
So that's what, when you see somebody sort of with a, shall we say, overly large bottom.
Exactly.
That's not obesity,
no,
it's
and
this.
It's also over the legs as well.
Yeah.
And it's sort of, and I think there's...
You see men like that as well.
Yeah, you do. And I think there's only sort of a couple of conditions in the country that are treating it. But I did read some good research recently that the new weight loss drugs may be useful for lipedema. So that's something to look out for.
Another one, I found that I have stage 4 endometriosis and adenomyosis. That's the one. Last year, after suffering since I was 15, I was struggling a lot during 2019. I went to a female GP who essentially laughed at me and told me because I can stand up, I don't have endo, and the only way they would treat me is with hormones and therapy. I'm now awaiting a hysterectomy at the age of 31 and a laparoscopy to try and get the endo off my bowel with a possible stoma. I mean, that sounds awful.
Absolutely awful. And you know, again, this speaks to what we said earlier, which is that, you know, this issue is not just coming from male doctors, male healthcare professionals. It's coming from across the board within the medical profession. And there we've just heard that endometriosis is very, very much an all-body condition. So now we're going to hear from Sophie in Wolverhampton. Sophie, hi there.
Hi, good evening. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Yes, I'm well, thank you. I've just been listening to your guys' show whilst driving home, and I felt compelled to ring in after the call from the lady that spoke about the language that was used when sort of talking to or describing female patients. I just wanted to caveat by saying that up until now I've had healthcare from male and female health practitioners, and I've never found any difference in the standards of care I've received. So I'm not, you know, male bashing by any means, but I've started experiencing issues over the past maybe 6 weeks or so that turns out, long story short, to be gallbladder and pancreatitis related. The first time I attended A&E, experiencing one of these flare-ups, which is probably the worst pain I've ever felt in my life, I saw a male doctor and got a very, very quick 5-minute, not appointment, visit with him. He didn't really take much history from me. He poked me for about 5 minutes and told me that it was probably my gallbladder and to take some paracetamol and make sure I don't eat anything that's too fatty. And then he sent me away. The next appointment I had was with a female. I had to go back to the A&E again because I had another flare-up, and this time I saw a female doctor in A&E. And the two experiences couldn't have been more different. She spent a good 20 minutes with me going through my clinical history. She had me up on that trolley in all sorts of bizarre positions, examining me and prodding me and poking me, and she sent me straight to the surgical assessment unit. because of the way the NHS systems work, I'm now referred to a consultant, but the hospital that my consultant works at can't see the records for my A&E attendances at a different hospital. So he's asked me to write to them. No, it's no problem, but I've written to them and been asked to request the records from A&E to send to the consultant. And I received them a couple of days ago and was quite gobsmacked, I suppose. The first doctor I saw, the chap, in the notes of my attendance, he's described me as hysterical and wailing. And then in the second write-up, when I saw the female doctor, she's just written patient in extreme distress due to significant pain. And I sort of felt a little bit flawed, thinking that this first doctor had made me out to be a bit of, like a crazy banshee. When in all reality, I was just in excruciating pain and couldn't really sit still and converse properly. And it sort of hit me for the first time then that have I just been unlucky and seen someone that perhaps was a bit tired, stressed and not really that interested on the first evening? Or have I just sort of been dismissed as being a hysterical woman?
And really
the way
nowadays,
the second doctor described me, so different.
Yeah. And really, nowadays, I qualified as a doctor in 2001, and even then we were sort of being taught how to communicate with patients and how to talk about patients, and you're never really supposed to describe patients in these emotive terms, and hysterical anyway is a derogatory term against women.
I remember, Sophie, when I was in hospital with a similar issue to you, a gallbladder issue, I had a male consultant who was very good and nice, and then a female junior doctor was looking at my notes. She goes, Iain Dale, yes, what do you do? What's your job? I said, I'm a radio presenter. Oh, you're that Iain Dale, are you? And then flounced off. I thought, oh, that's an interesting bedside manner.
Yeah, this was all supposed to, have been gotten rid of amongst doctors. you're supposed to be able
I just laughed. I thought it was hilarious.
Yeah, it's not really, I'm really sorry that that's what happened to you. And, I should say I work with incredibly caring male doctors who look after men and women in a very caring way. My late dad was a doctor, and he was a very, very caring person who never would have dismissed people like this. So I think this isn't about the gender of the doctor. I think this is very much, unfortunately, about sort of poor behaviour amongst some people.
Well, Sophie, thank you very much for that. One of the things I think I've learned from this hour is, well, apart from what endometriosis is that there seems to be a common complaint that not enough research is being done into specifically women's healthcare. So I think it's been really useful doing this. Ellie, thank you very much for guiding me through it, because I dread to think what it's been like without you. Thank you very much indeed. 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 Thank you very much indeed.